The Roman government was slow to take on new responsibilities. For example, it wasn't until Rome became an empire that it began to support or regulate education. Even in modern times, many European governments have been slow to take on such social roles. The first time Rome needed a large, well-funded treasury was during the Long War with Veii. Soldiers had to serve year-round, which meant they couldn't take care of their farms or businesses. This led to the introduction of stipendium, a small payment to soldiers. At first, it was just enough to cover their food, but it marked the beginning of regular taxes on Roman property. To modern readers, this tax may seem very low, often less than 0.1%, and it was sometimes refunded if the state collected enough money through war payments or loot. This tax was applied equally to all property. Land within the city's borders was taxed, even if it belonged to non-Romans. Roman citizens, whether living in Rome or elsewhere, also had to pay taxes on personal property like money, slaves, cattle, tools, and furniture. Even property owned by widows and orphans, which was originally not included in the tax lists because the census was designed for military service, was eventually taxed. The money from this tax helped fund the cavalry's equipment. The Samnite Wars dragged on for years in difficult, remote areas. They forced Rome to reorganize its army, build new roads, and spend heavily. The First Punic War was also extremely costly, especially because Rome lost around 700 warships in battles and storms. After the war, Rome demanded some compensation from Carthage, but it only covered a small part of the costs. More importantly, Rome adopted Carthage's idea that conquered territories should help pay for the costs of running the empire. Taxes from Sicily, like the grain tithe, helped reduce pressure on the Roman treasury. But during the Second Punic War, even Sicily's tithe wasn't enough to feed Rome's armies. Taxes were doubled or even tripled. New income taxes were added. People were asked for free donations, and public projects were done on credit. Rome also took loans using public land as security. In many ways, Rome's financial system during this time began to resemble a modern national treasury. The Roman Senate didn't like debt or complicated finances. After the war, they cleared the debt by handing over public lands to creditors, at first keeping the right to buy them back later, though even that right was eventually dropped. This helped Rome balance its budget. By 167 BC, thanks to income from state-owned mines, war payments, looted wealth, and rent from public lands in Italy and Spain, Rome's treasury had a large surplus. As a result, Rome stopped collecting direct taxes from its citizens. In Cicero's time, before Pompey added new eastern provinces like Syria, Bithynia, and Pontus, Rome's total annual income was about 50 million denarii, roughly 10 million modern dollars. Most of this came from provincial taxes. Smaller amounts came from rent on public lands, mines in Spain and northern Italy, fishing rights, a salt monopoly, a 5% tax on freed slaves, a 5% inheritance tax, and port fees. Taxes from each province varied depending on how and when they were conquered. For example, Sicily contributed about 1 million bushels of wheat annually, which was about 10% of the total revenue. Asia contributed around $1.5 to $2 million. The province of Narbo gave about $500,000. Based on size and wealth, Spain likely gave 1 million, Sardinia and Corsica 500,000, Africa 1 million, Macedonia 1 million, and Cilicia another 500,000. Other taxes likely added around 3 million more. Later, Pompey added about $6 million in taxes from Syria, Bithynia, and Pontus. Caesar conquered Gaul, adding at least another 1.5 million, and Augustus took control of Egypt, which, because it had been royal land, was now fully under Roman treasury control and added about $10 million in revenue. Altogether, during the early Roman Empire, the annual government budget was about $30 million, a small amount by today's standards. Tax systems varied between provinces. Rome often kept existing local methods of collection. In Spain, for example, Carthage had kept taxes low to make conquest easier. Rome followed the same strategy. Towns were assigned a fixed amount to pay, and they collected it themselves without interference from Roman tax agents. Their tax was about half of a full tithe. In Sicily, most farmland paid grain tithes. Fruit lands were taxed double, and pasture lands were taxed based on the number of animals. Taxes were estimated by both Roman officials and local towns, and contracts were sold to collect them. Local communities often bid on these contracts to protect their interests, but Roman businessmen with more money often outbid them and made large profits. In Verus's time, these men were supported by corrupt Roman officials, and Cicero found many examples of abuse when he gathered evidence for Verus's trial. In Asia, things were even worse after the tax law of Gaius Gracchus. Because fixed taxes were hard to manage in a region often hit by drought and invasions, the Romans chose a tithe on the actual crop. This system seemed fair, but many towns had little experience and failed to deliver the correct amount. The grain wasn't even needed in Rome, so transporting and selling it became a burden. Gracchus tried to fix this by giving tax collection rights to wealthy companies. These companies paid the state in advance and collected taxes themselves. Investors in Rome bought shares in these companies and expected high profits. Because many Roman citizens were financially involved, complaints from locals in Asia were often ignored. Sulla later replaced this with fixed payments, but Pompey brought back a modified version of the old system to satisfy the knights who had supported him politically. Caesar later reformed this and got rid of the worst parts. Under the empire, as more permanent government offices were created, the contract system was gradually replaced with salaried officials reporting to the emperor. Government spending went to administration, public works, religious duties, free grain distributions, the army, and managing the provinces. Officials still worked unpaid, but more staff and public slaves were needed. There was little spending on police or fire protection until Caesar's time. Even public games were paid from the treasury. About 10 to 20% of the yearly budget was spent on roads, aqueducts, public buildings, and other construction projects. Temples were still often built using war loot, donated by generals or maintained by their families. But sometimes the state paid for building and rituals. The grain handouts introduced by Gaius Gracchus cost about $1 million per year in Cicero's day, supplying 15 bushels of wheat per man at a low price. Later, Clodius passed laws that nearly doubled this cost to gain political support. But the biggest expenses were the army and the provinces. Some provinces actually cost more to govern than they contributed in taxes. The Senate didn't like the idea of a permanent army, fearing it might be used against them as Marius and Sulla had done. Still, wars in Spain, Africa, and the East forced the Senate to keep troops in the field and pass them from one general to another. Each soldier earned 120 denarii per year, and a legion's pay could exceed $100,000. Total costs were likely double that. In ordinary times, at least 20 legions were active, each in regions like Syria, Asia, Bithynia, Africa, Spain, and northern Italy. During wars, more troops were raised or moved to danger zones. In 67 BC, Pompey got $6 million, more than half the year's budget, to fight the pirates. In 55 BC, he was granted $1 million a year to support his army in Spain. Piso, Caesar's father-in-law, was also given $1 million to govern the peaceful province of Macedonia, likely as a political gift with no expectation of full spending. At the time, The Senate believed that nobles who had served Rome unpaid for many years deserved generous budgets as governors. Cicero, when leaving office in the modest province of Cilicia, had $100,000 left from the Senate's grant and another $100,000 left from provincial income. He didn't keep the money, which surprised some people. To understand how much more the empire eventually spent, we can look at Augustus' record of his achievements, which offers a better picture than any statistic. Augustus' public donations and spending. When I was consul for the 5th time, I gave 400 sesterces to every Roman citizen from the war spoils. Later, during my 10th consulship, I gave another 400 sesterces to each man, but this time from my personal funds. In my 11th consulship, I distributed food 12 times, paying for the grain myself. In the 12th year of my power as tribune, I again gave 400 sesterces to every man. None of these gifts were given to fewer than 250,000 people. In my 12th consulship, I gave 60 denarii each to 320,000 members of the Roman urban population. Again, during my 5th consulship, I gave 1,000 sesterces to each veteran soldier from my army as a reward from war spoils. About 120,000 soldiers received this gift. Later, during my 13th consulship, I gave another 60 denarii each to more than 200,000 citizens who were receiving state grain distributions. To provide land for soldiers retiring to colonies, I spent 600 million sesterces, around $30 million, for farmland in Italy and 260 million sesterces for land in the provinces. I also gave 400 million sesterces as retirement bonuses to soldiers returning to their hometowns. Rome had a unique way of using mines to raise money for the state. Ancient governments often treated mines containing gold and silver as public property. For example, Philip of Macedon ran the gold mines of Thrace for the state. Athens controlled the silver mines at Laurion, and Carthage exploited Spain's mines. During the Roman Republic, the government didn't always claim ownership of precious metal mines. Wealthy Romans like Crassus privately owned profitable mines in Spain. Sometimes the government even sold mines if it couldn't manage them efficiently. Still, when the government needed more income or had a chance to take control of profitable sites, the Senate showed interest in owning and running mines for the treasury's benefit. At one point in the 2nd century BC, gold mining operations in Spain may have earned the Roman state nearly $2 million a year. These mines were likely located on lands previously owned by Carthage and taken over by Rome after victory in war. Usually, when Rome took over a new province, it also claimed the mines, regardless of whether they were on public or private land. But during the Republican era, the Senate probably didn't claim ownership of newly discovered ore veins, at least not as a rule. Later, under the Empire, we have preserved some records about how mines in Spain were managed. These regulations can give us a good idea of how things worked earlier under the Republic, too. In these mining towns, everything belonged to the state, including the land and the town itself. An imperial official called a procurator oversaw operations. If someone wanted to run a mine, they had to first pay a fee to claim the land. Then, they had to begin mining within 25 days. Once they started, they had to either pay or provide security for a fee based on the estimated value of the ore, usually half of that amount. As long as the miner kept working without stopping for more than 6 months, they could keep operating the mine. If a mine was abandoned, someone else could take it under the same rules. But it wasn't just the mines. The state also rented out many businesses in these towns. For example, there was a public bathhouse, and whoever ran it had to follow strict rules. They had to keep the tubs filled with hot water daily, polish the metal fixtures once a month, and charge 1 cent for women from morning until 1 p.m. and half that price for men from 2 to 8 p.m. The government also controlled a shoemaker, barber shop, laundry, and auction house in the town. These businesses were run under government licenses and had to follow official price rules set by the procurator. The only people who didn't have to pay for a license were school teachers, who were free to work throughout the town. Most of the mining labor was done by slaves. But the laws about theft of ore mention punishments for both slaves and free men, showing that not all workers were enslaved. How industries grow and develop in any society often depends on the type of workers available and the social conditions they come from. In the American South, for example, African slaves were brought in because they could work long hours in hot climates, growing crops like tobacco and cotton. But once the South became dependent on slave labor, it shaped the region's economy for many decades. Before we look closely at the economic changes in Cicero's time, it's helpful to understand the changes in Roman society, especially among the lower classes. It's widely agreed that after the Second Punic War, the number of independent Roman farmers greatly declined. They were largely replaced by slaves and the children of slaves. When Cicero was running for consul in 64 BC, his brother wrote him a guide for winning the election. He advised Cicero to treat his slaves and freedmen well because they could influence public opinion and votes. This kind of advice helps explain why the late Republic saw so many riots and street fights, and how powerful people like Clodius gained control by leading organized labor groups. Even Caesar and Pompey didn't dare challenge him directly. But how did Rome become, as Cicero's brother put it, a city made up of all nations, when citizenship outside Italy hadn't been granted yet? It seems immigration played a small role. The bigger reason for this change was the rise of freed slaves and their descendants. Rome's many wars played a major part in reducing the native Italian population. The Second Punic War alone, with huge losses like those at Lake Trasimene and Cannae, may have wiped out a third of Roman citizens. Later wars in Greece, Asia, Spain, and against the Cimbri and the Italian allies also caused heavy losses. Even more damaging was the constant drafting of young men into military service. Often about 20% of men of marrying age were in the army. This meant fewer families and fewer children. Meanwhile, slaves and freedmen, who were not drafted, stayed at home and kept growing in numbers. After the Second Punic War, much of the land once held by Roman citizens was turned into large estates worked by slaves. Wealthy landowners preferred slaves over free laborers because slaves couldn't be taken for military service. Historian Appian noted that landlords used slaves so they wouldn't lose workers to the army, and that slaves had more children since they were safer and more stable. Over time, the rich got richer, slave numbers grew, and poor free citizens declined due to poverty, taxes, and war. If the poor had a break from hardship, they still couldn't farm because the land was owned by the rich, who relied on slaves. As a result, a new generation of Roman citizens, unable to get land in Italy, either stayed poor in the city or moved to the newly conquered provinces, and many were lost from the citizen population. For 40 years after the Second Punic War, even though many slaves were being freed, Rome's citizen population grew by only 1.3% per year. Then for the next 30 years, during which Rome added Macedonia, Africa, and Asia to its empire, the citizen population actually declined by 0.25% each year. The full reasons for this population drop are complex. We'd need to consider things like poverty, birth control, social customs, and lack of support for raising children. But even without all the data, there are clues. Roman literature and tombstone inscriptions show that most families had only 2 or 3 children. There are speeches like that of Metellus warning about people choosing not to have kids. Emperors passed laws giving tax breaks or other incentives to encourage larger families, and writers of the time recorded how poor people often said they couldn't afford to raise children. We even have solid numbers showing how fast the old Roman families disappeared. Of 45 noble, patrician families in the Senate during Caesar's time, only one had descendants in Hadrian's time. Well-known families like the Aemili, Fabii, Claudii, and others all vanished except the Cornelii. Augustus and Claudius created 25 new patrician families, but only 6 survived past Emperor Nerva's rule. In 65 AD, under Nero, 400 senatorial families were recorded, but half of them disappeared within a generation. Many of the survivors only continued through adopted children. While political violence played a role, most of this collapse was simply due to people choosing not to have children. It's not clear that this was mainly caused by exposing infants, a practice found in Greek stories and plays like those of Plautus. Roman law didn't allow people to expose healthy male babies, and tombstone records show boys and girls were raised in nearly equal numbers. Still, the fact that some families rejected having children helps us understand how this problem became widely accepted. Other social factors were more important. After the Punic Wars, the old Roman religion lost influence among the upper classes. That religion had once encouraged big families by teaching that children were needed to honor their ancestors in the afterlife. Also, young men often spent their best years serving in the army. When they returned, they were older, more worldly, and more likely to accept social habits like prostitution, which weakened family values. Lastly, it's worth noting that only in Rome and Greece, before the 19th century, did so many people live in comfort and develop a rational, individualistic lifestyle. That kind of freedom from traditional social pressures often discouraged large families, just as it sometimes does in modern societies. It's clear that the native Roman population declined. So, the next important question is, what replaced it? Immigration played only a very small role. In Cicero's time, most workers were slaves. Free men were usually too poor to move around for work. Foreigners weren't drawn to Italian farmlands because they required money to develop, and the city of Rome didn't have many jobs outside of those done by slaves. Even getting free food from the state in Rome required Roman citizenship, which most foreigners didn't have. The only outsiders who could benefit were the Greeks in southern Italy, who got citizenship after the Social War. But many of them moved to the provinces, where they often acted as middlemen between Roman investors and the Greek-speaking East. By looking at names on tombstones from the early empire, we can tell that there weren't many real foreign names in the city. Many small traders and shopkeepers had non-Italian origins, but most of them were freed slaves, not new immigrants. Only a few foreigners worked in areas like medicine, teaching, painting, or performing arts. Even in these fields, they had to compete with smart freedmen who had been trained by their former owners. Slaves, however, were easy to get in large numbers. The more obedient slaves came from Greek areas where people, during economic decline, sold off those they could not support. These regions also began to raise and train slaves to sell to the Roman market. In Asia Minor and surrounding areas, constant wars and bad leadership created many captives, including kidnapped children, who were sold by traders and pirates. Strabo even said that 10,000 slaves a day were sold in Delos at one point. Roman generals also brought in many war captives. Some were fierce warriors, useful only for hard labor or chained work. For example, a huge number of Sardinians were enslaved. One single campaign brought in 150,000 Epirates. Wars in Pontus added more slaves during the campaigns of Sulla, Lucullus, and Pompey. When Carthage was destroyed, many of its people were sold as slaves. The captured Cimbri later made up much of Spartacus's slave army. These slaves worked on farms and in Roman industries, and many of them eventually became Roman citizens. This is because Rome had very generous laws for freeing slaves. Once freed, slaves could become full citizens. Their children often entered trades and crafts that required legal rights. By Cicero's time, many plebeians were actually former slaves or their children. It's hard to know exactly what percentage of Rome's population came from this background because ancient writers didn't record full census data. But we do have many tombstones from the Empire period. These help us understand what people were called, what jobs they did, and whether they were born free or had been slaves. From names, we can often tell if someone was a slave, a freed person, or born a citizen. Foreign-sounding names often suggest someone came from outside Italy. And when the name is Greek, it usually means the person or their ancestors came from areas like Asia Minor or Syria, where Greek was spoken and many slaves were sold. When we analyze tombstones that include both parents and children, we often find that the second generation changed their names to sound more Roman. For example, a Syrian barber named Cinemus might change his name to Cinna, a very Roman-sounding name. This shows that foreign names were not respected, and people tried to blend in. This is strong evidence that many Roman families had foreign roots. Using this kind of evidence, researchers have found that about 90% of the people permanently living in Rome during the Empire came from non-Roman backgrounds. You might wonder if these foreign and slave families could grow in size and become part of Roman society. Some used to think that slaves working in rich Roman households had no time or money to raise families. But this turns out to be wrong. In fact, tombstone records from wealthy households show that slaves often married and had children, sometimes almost as many as free citizens. For example, one noblewoman's dressmaker married her butler. Another noblewoman's hairdresser was married to the man who guarded the silver. These records show that family life among slaves, even in elite households, was common. It's true that slave children were not always given tombstones, especially if money was tight or if the child was separated from the parents. But overall, it's clear that slaves raised families both in the countryside and in the cities. Also important is the fact that Rome freed many of its slaves. The process of manumission is well known. Smart and careful slaves, especially those from the East, could save money and buy their freedom. Others were freed for loyal service or in the wills of their masters. Many were given small businesses and earned their freedom by sharing profits. These freed people would often try to free their wives and children as well. As a result, Rome had many freedmen whose children were full Roman citizens. These families adopted Roman names and ways of life and hoped to rise socially. Some even succeeded in becoming as wealthy and powerful as the old noble families. We shouldn't think that this transformation in population happened only in the city of Rome. While Tacitus did call the capital the cesspool of the world, and Rome was certainly more affected than other places, the whole of Italy, and even parts of Western Europe, experienced similar changes. Even cities like Beneventum, Milan, and Patavium show many non-Italian names on their tombstones. The heart of Italy, where Rome's strongest soldiers once came from, also became heavily influenced by foreign people. If you look closely at inscriptions from places like the Marsi and Vestini regions, it's clear that even these central areas had become largely non-native. So it's not just Rome. The whole of Italy, and even Romanized areas of Gaul and Spain, became dominated by people of Eastern origin. In fact, most of these newcomers were from the East. If we analyze the names of slaves and freedmen in Rome, about 70% are Greek. In other parts of Latium, outside Rome, 64% have Greek names. Even in northern Italy, Cisalpine Gaul, where you'd expect more people from the north, 46% of the names are Greek. And many people with Eastern backgrounds changed their Greek names to Latin ones to hide their origins. So these numbers might even be too low. But why did Eastern people remain dominant, even though Rome fought many wars in Gaul, Germany, and Dacia, and brought back many captives? There's no clear answer, but a few guesses are possible. Slave raids and kidnappings might have continued more in the East than we know. As the Western economy grew, it may have drawn many slaves from a declining East. Eastern traders may have even bred slaves to sell to the West as a kind of export. On the other hand, northern captives may have quickly disappeared. For example, Caesar once noted that many of Spartacus's rebels were from the Cimbric tribes. They were strong but dangerous, and most of them were killed during the revolt. That gives us a clue. These northern people may not have lasted long. They were likely used for harsh labor in mines or on ships, where life was short. They didn't live long enough to start families, and they probably didn't even care to. That's why we find so little record of them. They lived hard lives and died quickly. In contrast, Eastern slaves were more likely to survive and settle into household jobs, where they could eventually be freed and start families. That's why their population grew so much, and they became a big part of Rome's people. This shift raises interesting questions about the Roman Empire's later changes. For example, was the rise of emperors and absolute power unavoidable once the original Italian population, who balanced freedom with discipline, was replaced by passionate people who had never known self-rule? Did the emotional and mystical religions of the East take over because the new people were more drawn to faith and feeling, unlike the old Romans who favored reason? Did Roman literature lose its originality because new writers copied the form without truly understanding the ideas behind it? Did Rome's ability to govern decline because the tough and determined Italians who built the empire were replaced by people with less strength and discipline? These are big questions, but they show the kind of deep social changes historians must study. Modern historians disagree a lot about Roman industry, especially about how advanced it was, what its goals were, and how it worked. Some see it as simple and rural, while others compare it to modern industrial systems. This confusion is mostly because ancient writers didn't focus much on economics or everyday jobs. Most Roman writers were politicians, interested in politics and wars, not labor. Aside from a few books, like some farming guides, Frontinus's writings on Rome's water system, and parts of Pliny's encyclopedia, there's little clear information. So, to truly understand Roman industry, we must rely on archaeology and material evidence. Generally, Roman producers were much closer to their customers than today. Most craftsmen worked in small workshops and sold directly to buyers. Full-scale factories were rare and only appeared when certain conditions made them possible. We'll understand these conditions better by looking at individual industries. One popular product in the time of Augustus was a red-glazed pottery decorated with low-relief designs, known as Aretine ware. These items often had the stamp of both the factory owner and the individual craftsman who made the mold for the design. These molds allowed for mass production, meaning that many identical pieces could be made quickly and efficiently, more like a factory process than individual handmade art. The craftsmen who made the designs were skilled and could shape detailed patterns using clay molds. However, they were not usually original artists like those who made famous Greek vases. Instead, they often copied patterns from silver dishes. In many cases, we know from the way their names are written that these designers were slaves or freedmen. If the mold makers were slaves, then it's likely the rest of the factory workers were too. The owners of these factories were Roman citizens, but many had non-Roman names, suggesting they or their parents were once slaves themselves. In fact, some factory owners seem to have started as slave designers who eventually earned their freedom. and took over the workshop. These factories could be quite large. For example, pottery from some of these companies has been found all over the Western Mediterranean region. While each company seemed to focus on certain trade routes, 3 areas, near Puteoli, Arretium, and the Po River Valley, were able to supply most of the empire's need for quality tableware, except in the southeastern regions. We can also tell how large these factories were by the number of designers involved. One factory under Cornelius had the names of about 40 designers. Other producers like Callidius Strigo and Perennius had at least 20 designers each. Many other firms in Arretium were also large. Eventually, to reduce shipping costs, some Roman pottery businesses opened branch factories in Gaul and other provinces. Over time, these provincial factories became so successful that they replaced the original ones. Whether it was due to better local materials, more energetic managers, or conservative tastes in the provinces, these branch factories won out. For example, a shipment of pottery sent to Pompeii right before the eruption included more Gallic pieces than Italian ones, even though it was packed in Rome. In this industry, we see that Roman manufacturers were able to set up large factories to produce goods on a wide scale. While this was not typical of all Roman industries, special conditions made it possible here. 2 main reasons explain this. First, making the red-glazed pottery required a special recipe for the clay, something like a trade secret. Even though other workshops could try to copy it, the exact process was still hard to reproduce. Second, the pottery needed a trained designer with good artistic skills. Since hiring such a skilled person was costly, it made sense for factory owners to employ many unskilled workers under that designer to make full use of his time. That's why this kind of factory production, though rare, to understand the difference, we can compare this with the mass production of simple clay lamps. These lamps were made in huge numbers and sold for very low prices. Some had decorations, but few showed any real artistic quality. They were made using basic molds and cheap clay. Because they were so cheap, it wasn't worth shipping them long distances. For a while, archaeologists believed certain well-known lamp makers had dominated large markets. But now we know that most of these lamps were made in small local workshops. These potters copied popular shapes and stamps from Rome, sometimes even using molds with Roman company names. Since there was no copyright and no special formula needed to make these lamps, anyone could start making them. There was no reason to build big workshops or gather many workers. So this industry remained spread out, with each town having its own small pottery. Most of the makers were probably freedmen, based on the Greek names found on the lamps. Another industry, glassmaking, had conditions more like the pottery factories. Glassmaking started in Egypt long ago and became very popular during Roman times. Egyptian factories likely produced beautiful mosaic glass, but we have little proof of their size because the pieces weren't marked. In contrast, clear glass made in Rome was often signed and provides more information. Around the time of Augustus, a new method was discovered: blowing air into hot glass using a pipe. This made it possible to create clear glass faster and more cheaply than before. It also allowed makers to use a permanent outer mold to shape the glass, including popular patterns and figures. This new method led to mass production. Many glass items were made in one place using molds created by skilled designers. The actual glass blowing could then be done by less skilled workers. Again, like the pottery factories, this was a reason to gather many workers in a single location. These glassmakers often had Greek names and said they were from Sidon, a Phoenician city. Some glass may have come from Sidon, but much of it was probably made in Rome or Italy by craftsmen who moved west to find better markets. It's possible these were the glass factories near the Volturnus River that Pliny the Elder mentions. The brick-making industry in Rome also started to look like a factory-based system, though for different reasons than other industries. During the Republic, brick-making was not very important. Most public buildings were made with stone blocks. When concrete started being used, it was often covered with stone or small square tiles. Clay was mainly used to make roof tiles. But during the early empire, up to the reign of Emperor Claudius, builders began to use broken tiles to face concrete walls. Under Claudius, brick facing became more common, and brickmakers had to produce new shapes and forms. It was during the reign of Nero, especially after the Great Fire that destroyed much of the city, that brickmaking really expanded. The kilns in Rome had to produce huge amounts of bricks to rebuild the city. From that point on, brick-faced concrete became the main building material. This industry had forces both pulling it in different directions and bringing it together. The recipe for making bricks was very old and not a secret. Also, there was no shortage of good clay. The best clay came from areas near the Anio and Tiber rivers, where silt from the mountains mixed with volcanic ash. Most of the best bricks of ancient Rome were made in this region. Because bricks were heavy and hard to transport, most firms couldn't sell their products very far. Only a few brick stamps are found widely across the empire. Bricks were sent by boat down the Tiber to Ostia, and some came from other parts of Italy by sea. Sometimes wealthy people paid to bring in bricks from Rome for their country villas. But usually, brick transport was limited. Still, some Roman brick companies became very large. One example is Domitius Afer, a famous speaker from Gaul who came to Rome with little money during the time of Tiberius. He became rich through his talent and connections and bought land, something wealthy Romans often did. Brickmaking was seen as part of farming, which made it a respectable business for landowners. Afer's adopted sons, Tullus and Lucanus, expanded the business, especially after the fire in Nero's time. They used their political connections to grow even more, buying many brickworks and running them through dozens of managers. Their brick stamps appear on nearly every major building from that time. These estates were later inherited by Lucanus's daughter Lucilla, and then by her grandson, the future emperor Marcus Aurelius. By his reign, many of Rome's brick factories had become imperial property. This near monopoly happened because the families that owned the factories had married. It's interesting that brickmaking was one of the few industries where Roman nobles openly connected themselves to business profits. This was likely because it was considered part of agriculture. Roman nobles were expected to manage land, and using clay deposits to make tiles or bricks was a normal way to make money from the land. Asinius Pollio was one of the first to put his name on tiles made at his villa, and it's likely that Cicero also did the same at his home near Tusculum. Another point worth noting is that brick stamps often include the names of both the owner and the factory manager, who was almost always a slave or freedman. This reflects how large Roman estates were typically run. The owner lived elsewhere and placed a trusted slave or freedman in charge of daily operations. The factory manager who stamped bricks with his own name alongside his master's had a respected and responsible role, similar to the villicus, or overseer on a country estate. Finally, when it comes to making metal items like bronze or lead objects, we also find some useful details from ancient texts and from makers' marks stamped into the products. The Romans made high-quality wrought iron and steel, mainly for weapons and farming tools. But because they hadn't yet invented the bellows with valves, they couldn't fully melt iron ore. This meant they didn't know about cast iron, the cheapest and most useful form of the metal. Instead, they had to shape iron by repeatedly heating and hammering it, which was slow and expensive. Old records show that iron cost about $6 per 100 pounds, which is high, especially when compared to how cheaply Romans could get copper. In Cicero's time, the center of Roman iron production was Puteoli. The iron ore came from the island of Elba. Workers heated the ore in low furnaces until it became sponge-like. Then blacksmiths forged it into tools and weapons. Earlier, during the Second Punic War, the Etruscan cities controlled iron production, but later Puteoli took over. This city had everything needed: cheap fuel from volcanic fields, a great harbor, easy access to farmland, and it served as a supply hub for the Roman army and navy. One ancient writer, Diodorus, described how Puteoli became a major center of ironworking, with many blacksmiths making weapons, hoes, sickles, and other tools. This sounds like a large industrial system with international trade. But we must be careful not to exaggerate. Since furnaces couldn't fully melt iron, tools couldn't be cast in molds like they are today. Every item had to be shaped by hand, which meant there was little specialization or advanced machinery. Most of the work was done by individual craftsmen at small forges. Still, some large workshops probably did exist, with skilled workers, whether slaves or free, making tools together. But without strong evidence, we shouldn't assume there were true factories like in the pottery or glass industries. In fact, most cities had small workshops where ironworkers made and sold their own tools. Tombstones of Roman craftsmen often show their trade, like sword maker, shield maker, or helmet maker. One tombstone in the Vatican even shows a blacksmith working at his forge on one side and selling knives on the other. This was common in Roman industry. The government also played a role in the weapons trade. Each army had its own smiths to repair and make gear. In the Republic, soldiers had to buy their own equipment before joining the army. So many private shops supplied these items. Cities also kept public armories, like the one found at Pompeii, which likely bought weapons from private makers. In later times, however, the Roman government began making all military gear in state-owned factories across the empire. When it came to bronze and copperware, real factory systems did seem to exist, especially in Capua. At the end of the Republic and early Empire, large amounts of bronze household items were produced, such as wine jugs, bowls, ladles, and cooking pots. These often had maker's marks and were found not just in Italy, but as far away as Germany, Scotland, Sweden, and Finland. Capua had a long tradition of bronze work. Early Etruscans started the industry there, and Roman authors like Cato and Pliny praised its products. The city continued making high-quality bronze goods even into medieval times. In fact, the family names found on bronze items match those found on tombstones in Capua, showing it was likely the production center. A researcher named Willers believed these bronze factories were huge, possibly employing thousands. Since bronze items were often melted down later for reuse, it's impressive that so many have survived. Making these items required many steps: melting metal, mixing it with tin or zinc, shaping it in artist-made molds, then polishing and decorating it. This took many skilled workers and a lot of money, very much like a modern factory system. It is quite likely that the bronze factories in Capua made it possible to produce the many bronze statues, busts, and decorative art objects found at Herculaneum and Pompeii. While many archaeologists still think these works came from Greek studios, like those in Athens, there is strong evidence of high-quality local craftsmanship. For example, the bust of Caecilius Jucundus, a Pompeian banker, shows that skilled artists were working in the region. In Cicero's time and in the following century, it's very possible that the Capuan foundries made many statues for both Greek and local artists based in Naples. So much of the artwork that people once believed was imported might actually have been made locally. In fact, much of the elegant bronze furniture found in Pompeii, like lampstands, tables, braziers, and tripods, was likely made possible thanks to the advanced bronze-working skills developed in Capua. These pieces even went on to influence later decorative art styles. On the other hand, the production of water pipes did not develop into a large factory-based industry, even though there was high demand for standard-sized pipes. Most of what we know about this comes from Frontinus, a Roman official who managed the water system, and from stamps found on the pipes showing the names of the owners and makers. The Roman Imperial Water Bureau handled the building and maintenance of aqueducts and supplied water to public places like palaces, baths, gardens, and fountains. In Frontinus's time, the bureau had around 700 slaves working for it, including those who made and laid the pipes. These public pipes often had the names of the maker, the water commissioner, and the emperor stamped on them. Interestingly, even the Imperial Bureau often hired outside plumbers to help with the work. Frontinus himself mentions having to hire contractors for certain jobs. We also know that many wealthy private citizens in Rome paid for their own water connections. These pipes were usually stamped with the owner's name, which helped identify them during repairs, especially since many pipes ran side by side under the streets. Pipe makers often added their own names to the pipes as well. What stands out is that no single pipe-making business seems to have dominated the market. Names rarely appear in more than one part of the city, and large pipe orders were usually split between several small plumbers. Also, the stamps were part of the original mold, meaning the pipes were made to order, not mass-produced or kept in stock. The process was handled by small shop owners with just a few slaves and very limited resources. When someone placed an order, these craftsmen would buy lead, melt it, roll it into sheets, cut it into strips, and solder it into pipes, then install the pipes themselves. In other words, the same person who made the pipe also laid it. This method was slow and inefficient, and it's unclear why it continued for so long. One reason might be that each pipe had to be clearly marked with the owner's name for legal reasons. But there were other ways to achieve this. The real reason seems to be that the small shop system resisted change. Even when there were good reasons to centralize and modernize the process, the old way of doing things stuck around, a common trend seen in many Roman industries. Many of the people working in this trade, especially if they owned their own small shops, were freedmen or came from similar backgrounds. This is shown by the frequent use of Greek names. Often these workers had learned their trade while they were slaves in government workshops. For example, the plumber who installed the pipes in a large villa on the Appian Way was a freedman who had once served the emperor. At Ostia, some plumbers even used Ostiensis as their name, instead of a family name. We can also see different types of business practices in the work of jewelers and goldsmiths. There is no sign that jewelry was made in large factories. Rings, pendants, and other decorative items were mostly created and sold in small shops. Sometimes, people called negociantes acted as dealers, but they were not always craftsmen. Because the materials, like gold and precious stones, were very expensive, most jewelry was made to order. People often brought their old gold or uncut stones to the goldsmith to have them made into new items. But this wasn't the only way the trade worked. Some goldsmiths owned their own materials and created pieces to sell. Roman legal cases also mention goldsmiths as both workers and business owners. Tombstones of many jewelers show they became quite wealthy. Some left behind large inheritances or had long lists of freedmen who once worked for them. In many cases, rich patrons set up shops for their talented slaves or freedmen as a way to invest their money. One inscription from a patron to his freedmen says, "To Marcus Canuleius Zosimus, from his patron. He always obeyed my wishes. Even though he had much gold and silver, he was never greedy. He was excellent at carving Clodion-style jewelry." Closely connected to jewelers were the gemmery, or gemstone engravers. These artists carved detailed images on small stones for rings and cameos. In ancient Rome, it was important for every man of status to have a personal seal ring. In the late Republic, the wealthiest Romans hired the best engravers for this work. Some of these seals still survive today and are considered great works of art. There were different levels of skill in this field. For example, Dioscurides was a famous artist from the East who came to Rome to make the emperor's official seal. He didn't need a shop because of his reputation and talent. He represents the skilled Greek or Eastern craftsman who came to Rome to find better opportunities. At the other end of the spectrum were local engravers whose simple tombstones describe them as working on the Sacred Way, which was the street where jewelers had their shops. These workers were likely freedmen who had trained as slaves and then saved money to open their own small shops. Interestingly, some engravers signed their work in Greek, but used a Roman-style first name. This likely means they were immigrants who became Roman citizens, possibly as a reward for their artistic talent. By using Greek for their signature, they were probably trying to show that their work was high quality and not the rough style of native Roman craftsmen. These signatures tell us that for at least this one fine craft, Rome relied heavily on skilled workers from Greece and the East. The lower quality work was done by apprentice slaves, and the small jewelry shops were usually run by freedmen. Large-scale production didn't happen in this trade because customers wanted personalized work from well-known artists, and most items had to be made specifically for each buyer. It would be wrong to draw conclusions about Roman industry by looking only at large businesses. Thankfully, because the ruins of Pompeii are well preserved, we can study the economy of a smaller Roman town in more detail. This helps give us a fuller picture of how industry worked in ancient times. Pompeii was not a typical Roman city in every way. It was a small port town that focused more on trade than on manufacturing. Its people, influenced by Greek culture, seem to have more respect for manual labor than the old Roman upper classes. Still, we shouldn't overstate this difference. The leading group in Pompeii, wealthy landowners, were descendants of Roman soldiers from Sulla's time, and they brought Roman customs with them. Despite the city's smaller size, its economic life was similar to that of bigger cities. In ancient times, when goods were made and sold more locally, a town of 25,000 people was quite important. If we could find a few blocks of a street from Nero's Rome, the layout of the shops and stalls would look much like Pompeii's. In Pompeii, space inside the city walls was used carefully. Shops lined the busy streets, while homes were placed in the middle of each city block. One block, Regio 7, Insula 2, had about 40 shops, mostly along the main roads, with about 10 houses in the middle, entered from quieter side streets. The first big house on Via Stabiana belonged to Paquius Proculus, a well-known baker who was elected as a Duumvir. He even had a portrait of himself, wearing a white toga painted on his office wall. Proculus had joined two houses together and replaced their gardens with a bakery that included mills and workrooms. However, he chose not to use the 5 shops in front of his house to sell bread. These shops were rented out separately. Near this house, a political notice shows he also owned a large bakery with 5 mills across the street. There, he could bake without dirtying his official toga. Proculus is a good example of the wealthy local officials who also ran successful businesses. Another house had been turned into a dyeing workshop during the early empire, when making clothes became an important trade in Pompeii. The owner didn't build a new factory, but instead used a regular house, living in part of it while working in the other part, just like Proculus. The next notable house was large and beautiful, and had a fine peristyle. Its owner, M. Gavius Rufus, seems to have been wealthy, though we don't know how he earned his money. His house had no direct connection to any shop. Next door, C. Vibius Severus, probably another local politician, had made the back of his house into a workshop. Rooms near the courtyard were used for storage and connected directly to a shop on the street. N. Papidius Priscus lived in the grandest house of all. His family had lived there for a long time, as shown by an old Oscan inscription in the courtyard. The source of his wealth became clear upon seeing that his house had 3 separate doors leading to different shops. Inside, archaeologists found a bronze stamp used by bakers, marked with his name. One door led to a large bakery with 5 horse-powered mills, a dough mixer, and an oven big enough to bake 2,000 loaves a day. However, there were no sales counters, suggesting he either sold his bread somewhere else or sold it in bulk. Papidius had other businesses too. One door led to a wine bar with many jars and an inviting double door for customers. Another door led to a workshop connected to 2 storefronts, although we don't know what was made or sold there. He may also have owned farmland. Whatever his sources of income, he was clearly a very rich man, judging by his luxurious home. These houses, hidden behind the rows of small shops that lined the 4 surrounding streets, give us a good example, confirmed by other similar areas, of a society that was slightly less traditional and a bit more practical than the Roman upper class described in formal Roman literature. The people who lived in these houses decorated their courtyards with marble statues of cupids and forest spirits, and painted their dining room walls with scenes from Homer and Euripides. Many of them were elected by their neighbors to important city positions and honored with expensive titles. Surprisingly, many of these respected citizens of Pompeii were successful bakers, potters, and leather workers. They did not look down on making a living from small businesses, so long as it brought in enough profit. Still, most of the doors in this block led to small, separate shops, some just 1 or 2 rooms, sometimes with a small upstairs room reached by stairs. This is where the majority of the population lived and worked, cramped into small spaces with a shop facing the street where they worked and sold goods. These little workshops show the true nature of ancient industry, which had many small-scale craftsmen who focused on just one skill. Their workspaces are often recognizable by remains of tools like workbenches, furnaces, or forges, and by special door frames with grooves where big shutters once opened wide to attract customers during the day. A famous painting of Cupids working as goldsmiths gives us a clear idea of this kind of life. Some Cupids are at the furnace, some are hammering or crafting, and one is selling to a customer. Except for the fact that Pompeii had more free workers than Rome, these combined work and sales shops were typical for Roman towns. It was from these shops that Romans got everyday items: clothes, shoes, jewelry, lamps, furniture, home decorations, and kitchen tools. So, when you walk around a normal block in Pompeii, the first thing you see is a lively area full of tiny shops where poor artisans are making and selling their crafts. But behind these shops are larger homes, owned by richer men, who helped run or benefited from these small industries. When we look at the whole city, though, the picture becomes more complicated. To understand Pompeii's economy better, we need to look at what was found in these shops, especially things with labels or maker's marks. Most of the basic clay tableware used in Pompeii wasn't made locally. It came from well-known pottery centers like Iridium, Puteoli, Capua, and some places in Gaul, modern France. There's no proof that Pompeian workshops made this high-quality Aretine pottery. Even simple mixing bowls, called mortaria, were usually imported, often stamped with the names of Roman makers, and none had local trademarks. However, larger and rougher clay items like roof tiles and wine jars were made nearby, the products of L. Vesalius, a popular pottery maker in Herculaneum, were also found in nearby towns. Although over 50 people made these items, only a few left behind many stamped examples, so there wasn't any single company that dominated the market. Like in Rome, tile making was probably seen as part of farming. A landowner with clay in his fields might make tiles and jars for his own use or to sell to neighbors. As for luxury silver dishes, much of it used by the wealthy in Pompeii came from workshops in the Campania region. A silver mirror from a famous treasure in Bosco Real was signed by M. Domitius Polygnos, a freedman. The other pieces had Latin ownership marks, and 2 cups showed scenes of Augustus and Tiberius, possibly copied from Roman monuments. If such fine items were made locally, then Pompeii's own silver workers may have been capable of similar work. It's possible that making silver goods was no longer done by solo craftsmen, but by larger workshops. These workshops may have used division of labor, where each worker had one task, like shaping, polishing, decorating, or gold plating, instead of making a whole piece. That might explain why few items are signed, why styles from Egypt, Syria, and Rome are mixed together, and why some decorations don't quite match. Some silver specialists even had specific job titles like figurator, flaturarius, triter, innorator, and collator. Even the writer Pliny mentions that styles in silver plate changed often. One year people wanted Furnian silver, then Clodian, then Gratian, something likely caused by big workshops, not individual artists. What was said earlier about iron and bronze work fits Pompeii as well. The city was close to metal factories in Puteoli and Capua, so it didn't need many local smiths. Instead of many small blacksmith shops, Pompeii had hardware stores that simply sold tools and items without making them. These shops, despite years of looting, still contained farm tools, locks, keys, pots, pieces of harness, cheap jewelry, and small bronze decorations. We don't know exactly where or how the fancy furniture of Pompeii was made. None of the items have labels that tell us which factory made them. Simple furniture was probably made in small local workshops, but archaeologists haven't found any workshop that looks advanced enough to produce the more elegant pieces. Items like beds, chairs, and dining couches needed skilled workers with different talents, and the materials used to make them cost a lot of money. The wooden legs of the furniture had to be shaped using special tools, carved by hand, and often decorated with inlays. The frames were sometimes decorated with bronze or silver, carved ivory, tortoise shell, or even small gemstones. The headrests and backs were often covered with thin layers of valuable materials, and the metal parts were shaped into figures like horses' heads, dolphins, or satyrs, made either by molding, hammering, or carving. Even if some metal pieces were bought from places like Capua, this kind of furniture clearly required big workshops with many skilled workers in both wood and metalwork. The mix of carved stone, fine wood, and metal in tables, stands, and lamps also suggests that these were factory-made. A Roman inscription mentioning a group of citron woodworkers in Naples might hint at the center of this industry. Another Roman guild for dealers of ivory and citron wood supports the idea that such fancy furniture was made near Pompeii and sold in large numbers in Rome. When it came to bread making, as we saw earlier, it became a large-scale business. But because bread goes stale quickly and fuel was hard to get, baking stayed mostly local. Very few houses in Pompeii had their own ovens. Some big ovens in town might have been shared by neighborhoods, like in many Italian towns even today. The lack of good milling tools and the cost of fuel might explain why bread baking was done mostly in large shops. In Rome, large bakeries took over the market too. Evidence from inscriptions and a carved stone panel on a baker's tomb at Porta Maggiore shows that big businesses quickly became the main suppliers. Later on, the Roman government even took control of bread distribution, giving out free loaves to the poor instead of raw grain. There was also some large-scale wine trade. We know this because wine jars often had labels showing they came from places like Kos, Cnidus, Sicily, Falernum, and Cumae. A man named Cornelius Hermeros might have been a wine dealer. His name appears on jars of both local and imported wines. Still, no big wine storehouse has been found in Pompeii. Among over 1,000 wine jars with names on them, very few names are repeated. So, there probably wasn't a big system of middlemen or organized wine merchants. Most of the names and initials on the jars seem to belong either to vineyard owners or to the farm managers who ran wine-producing estates. It looks like wine was usually delivered straight from the vineyards to people's homes or private wine cellars, just like today, when farmers near Rome still deliver their wine by cart each morning. In Rome, of course, wine trading was bigger. The city needed large amounts of both local and imported wines, and big stockpiles were needed. During Roman parades, hundreds of thousands of liters of wine could be handed out to the crowd in just one day. Olive oil was traded in a similar way. In Pompeii, it was usually sold in small amounts directly from farmers to shopkeepers. No big oil warehouse has been found in the city. The jars that were found often had the names of nearby farms on them. An old Roman writer, Cato, mentions that in earlier times some businessmen would buy olives still on the trees, harvest them, and produce oil themselves. Maybe this happened because farmers didn't yet know the best way to make oil, or maybe because it wasn't in high demand at that time. Later, when the screw press was invented, a simple machine for pressing olives, farmers could easily make oil on their own farms. That's likely how things worked in Pompeii. In Rome, the situation was different. Wealthy people wanted the best oils from South Italy, Spain, and Africa, so special trade groups formed just for olive oil. Over time, Roman emperors began giving out free oil to the public, and this forced the government to take full control of the oil trade in the city. The huge pile of broken oil jars behind the old Roman port is made up of containers used for shipping this government oil. During World War I, it was even used by the Italian army as an anti-aircraft post. A good example of large-scale factory production in Pompeii is the famous fish sauce business run by the wealthy official Umbricius Scaurus and his freedmen. They made sauces called garum and liquamen. Many jars with his company's name have been found in Pompeii, showing that this was a very large business. His brand was so well known that it almost had a monopoly in the city. This was also one of the few Pompeian products sold outside the city. Even Pliny mentioned Pompeii's garum as one of the top 3 brands in the Roman world. In fact, a jar marked garbage, Pompeian, was found in Rome. Still, some wealthy food lovers in Pompeii preferred the more famous Spanish garum made by a large company of Roman tax collectors. A jar of this Spanish brand was found in the home of M. Gavius Rufus. We don't yet fully understand how the clothing trade worked in the Roman world, but Pompeii might someday help answer that. The nearby hills likely supported thousands of sheep, and the many fulleries found in Pompeii suggest it became a key city for clothing production in Campania. In the Middle Ages, when clothes were no longer made entirely at home, the business grew as farmers or weavers began organizing the work. One person might buy the wool and then pass it from one household to another, from spinner to weaver, until it became finished fabric. Later, when trade expanded, cloth merchants gathered the finished cloth in a central place where buyers could view it, and merchants could sell the extra cloth in foreign markets. Big clothing factories didn't really appear until machines were invented, because machines required everyone to work in one place where power was available. In Pompeii, spinning and weaving were still done at home. We know this because archaeologists have found many small spinning tools, and there's even a list scratched onto a column in the house of Terentius Eudoxus, showing how 11 slave women spent their free time spinning. As long as such easy work could be done at home during free time, there was no need for factories or powerful machines. This also explains why there were no large worker groups for spinners and weavers in ancient Italy. But the next steps in making cloth, cleaning, bleaching, shaping, trimming, and dyeing, were more complicated and had to be done by professionals. People no longer wore simple homemade cloth, even if they weren't very rich. The cloth had to go to a fuller, who cleaned and processed it, and sometimes sent it to a dyer. The soft, colorful fabric shown in Pompeian wall paintings gives us an idea of the final look. The fulleries in Pompeii had expensive tools, special tanks, and skilled workers, so we can call them factories. However, they still worked out of regular houses and didn't grow into huge buildings. This shows how Roman industry stayed traditional and small-scale. Even so, fullers in Pompeii did make progress. During the early Roman Empire, a wealthy woman named Eumachia built a large hall near the city's main square, Forum, for the fullers. This building wasn't a fullery. It had no tools or tanks, so it was likely a market hall, similar to London's Blackwell Hall. This suggests that the fullers not only cleaned the cloth, but also sold it directly to buyers. It's possible that, like in England, the fullers in Pompeii began to buy cloth from others, finish it, and act as the sellers. But we don't know if they ever tried to take over the whole process, starting from raw wool, organizing the spinning and weaving, and even selling in foreign markets through trade agents, like the cloth guilds in England later did. In this area of trade, Pompeii seems to reflect the typical Roman way of life. Roman writers often mention that female slaves in homes spent their free time spinning and weaving. There is no evidence of clothing factories in Italy, and ancient writings don't mention any worker guilds for spinners or weavers. However, guilds of fullers were important. In fact, several cities, including Pompeii, had special buildings for them, and in Rome, they were even given discounts on water charges. Of course, this doesn't mean that rich people in cities like Rome wore homemade cloth, but many good quality fabrics likely came from household looms, and after being cleaned, combed, and dyed by fullers, the cloth was good enough to sell. For wealthier customers, there were always imported fabrics, like fine Egyptian linen, handmade cloth from Anatolia, purple dyes from Syria, and Coan silks from Greek islands. Clothing itself didn't require a large clothing industry, because Roman garments were usually simple pieces of cloth that didn't need much sewing. They were worn almost as they came off the loom. In Pompeii, shoemaking, like elsewhere, was done by small, individual cobblers. These workers were often seen as low status. There was probably a shoemakers guild in the town, and some of their shops have been identified. One example is in Insula 4:3, where the cobbler also worked as a doorman to earn extra money. In Rome, shoemakers often worked in the Subura district, where many shoe shops were located. You can imagine what it looked like by thinking of the small shoe stalls in markets in Athens, or the bazaars of Istanbul. There was even a guild in Rome, with about 300 shoemakers who made women's shoes. This shows how small and specialized the trade was. By contrast, the person who provided leather, the tanner, was much more important. Tanning leather needed a lot of space, tools, and money, so it wasn't something that could be done in a tiny workshop. A large tannery found in Regio Futur, 5 in Pompeii, may have supplied all the leather needed for the shoemakers and harness makers in the town. This is one of the few cases where the type of work naturally led to large-scale production. When it comes to farming, we already know from writers like Cato and Varro that by the 2nd century BCE, many farms had become capitalist businesses, run to make money, not just to feed the family. We now understand this better thanks to the discovery of a large villa at Bosco Real, 2 miles from Pompeii. This farm clearly belonged to someone who was both a skilled farmer and a wealthy city man. He had a lot of farming tools, wine vats, and signs of production. But he also owned expensive silver dishes, now displayed in the Louvre Museum, showing his wealth and high social status. This landowner wasn't focused on running a self-sufficient household. Instead, he used his land like a business, producing goods to sell. He didn't worry about making everything his household needed. Most of his farm was used for growing grapes for wine, as shown by the 2 large presses and storage jars that could hold about 12,000 gallons. He also grew some olives, proven by the olive press and jars nearby. There were few animals, so he didn't need to grow hay. His storage room had many tools like hoes and pruning hooks, but no scythes or shears, which tells us the farm didn't raise animals or make wool. A small mill and oven showed that he grew enough grain for his own use, but not enough to sell. There's no sign of female slaves spinning and weaving, suggesting that the farm didn't produce its own cloth. The rich soil near Mount Vesuvius was too good for grazing animals, so no wool was produced, and the family likely bought their clothing. Also, the idea that these big farms were self-reliant in labor and equipment doesn't hold up. The house was built by skilled builders using fancy masonry styles. It was painted by professional artists, decorated with terracotta ornaments, and fitted with baths and plumbing systems, work done by specialists from Pompeii. All of this matched the high-end furniture, silverware, and decorative items found in the house. Even the farm tools were standard items made by trained craftsmen, and the pottery and bricks had factory stamps from Pompeii. This shows that the owner wasn't focused on farming for household use. To him, the land was more like a factory where he made one product to sell for profit. He only lived on the farm when it suited him, maybe to stay close to the business or just to enjoy the country air, not because he needed to live off the land. This was the economic setup of Pompeii, and it directly influenced the city's social structure. First of all, farming was likely seen as the most respectable job, both in Pompeii and in Rome. It's likely that the land distributed by Sulla to his soldiers in 80 BC included vineyards on the slopes of Vesuvius and rich vegetable gardens, rather than city shops. In the early years, when these veterans ran the city government, they probably held all the high offices. Families like the Holconi and Quincti, who were known for their public generosity, likely belonged to this group. Still, people in Pompeii did not look down on making money through business. This is clear from examples like Vedius Syracus, who proudly displayed a greeting to profit, or the well-known trademarks of the fish sauce makers, tile producers, and mill owners like Proculus, many of whom were elected to city offices. If someone like Caecilius Jucundus, a wealthy banker and auctioneer, did not become a city magistrate, it was probably because of a Roman law that banned auctioneers from holding public office, not because of low social status. Much of the successful business in Pompeii was likely managed by freedmen, just as it was in Rome, as shown in Cicero's letters. But in Pompeii, many people had Greek names, making it hard to tell who was a freedman just by name. Even so, in the cemeteries, the most elaborate tombs often celebrate the person's position as a sevir, which was a common honor given to freedmen. Slaves also took part in the city's business life, not just in physical work, but also in office tasks. Many of the seals and stamps used to mark products and legal documents show the names of both the slave who used them and his master. For example, some loaves of bread in the Naples Museum are marked with a stamp naming Celer, a slave of Granius Verus. From election posters, we can also see that Pompeii had many free citizens. The people supporting political candidates included not only wealthy bakers, millers, and fullers, but also small shop owners, like goldsmiths and animal doctors, as well as stall vendors who sold fruit or perfumes. Workmen's groups also show up: dyers, porters, grape pickers, and woodworkers. While it's true that not every supporter was necessarily a citizen, it wouldn't make sense to post public endorsements from guilds made up mostly of slaves. The huge number of small bars and lunch counters also suggests a large population of free, working-class people who had enough money to buy small meals or snacks daily. Some of these workers were independent craftsmen, running shops from their small homes. Others were clients of wealthy citizens. Many were freedmen set up in business by their former owners, often working in shops attached to their patron's house and likely sharing profits. So far, we've looked at how Roman industries worked and how they appeared in a single city. We shouldn't try to fit such a complex system into one simple model. Still, knowing that conditions always changed and that our sources are limited, we can try to organize the main factors that either helped or limited Roman industry. The simple economy of household farming may still have existed in the mountain areas of Italy during Cicero's time, but there is little sign of it elsewhere. Roman farms were often designed to be self-sufficient, meaning they produced almost everything they needed using their own slave labor, including skilled tasks. But this wasn't a sign of primitive living. It actually reflected a wealthy and complex economy, where a rich landowner could afford to have every comfort made on-site. In the cities, the economic system was similar in many ways to that of early 1800s New England, where small-town artisans made most of what their communities needed. But Roman cities were already becoming larger, and the number of wealthy people willing to spend on luxuries and fine goods was much higher than in early modern times. To meet these demands, a wide trading system had already developed. In some areas of production, industries began to grow to supply goods not just for local use, but for larger markets. The reasons why large-scale production and monopolies developed in the Roman world were not very different from the ones we see today. For example, the Sidonian glassmakers became successful, likely because they discovered a new method of glass blowing and even built a factory on the coast of Italy. In Arretium, the potters had high-quality clay and many skilled workers and artists, which helped them become famous around the world. Similarly, special food recipes, like certain fish sauces and wine, helped some producers gain large markets. Producing silver and bronze items often required teams of skilled workers and a lot of money to buy expensive materials. This made it more likely for production to become concentrated in large workshops. The same was true for furniture made with costly wood, metals, and marble, which needed both talent and resources. Fulleries and tanneries also grew larger, because they used chemicals and tools that regular people couldn't easily get. In wholesale bread making, it made sense to work in larger bakeries to save space and labor, especially as fuel became expensive and flour was hard to grind at home. Some towns became known for iron products. In these cases, fuel supply likely played a role. Also, because tools like weapons or farming equipment weren't always in high demand, small producers who didn't have enough money to wait for the right time to sell could not compete. But simpler items like cutlery were still made in small shops because they sold steadily. Sometimes accidents or events helped industries grow. For instance, after the Great Fire in Rome, a few brickmakers who already had the tools and workers ready got huge contracts to rebuild the city. This helped them grow rapidly. Although a full factory system didn't exist in every industry, many trades, like silverware, bronze items, pottery, glass, furniture, bricks, and some special foods, already used division of labor, some machines, and technical processes. Many of these industries clearly aimed at large markets and required big investments. However, There were still many things that prevented industries from growing more. Slow transportation made it hard to move perishable, easily spoiled goods between towns. Heavy but cheap goods, like simple clay pots, cost too much to transport to be worth selling far away. There were no patent laws, so new inventions or techniques were quickly copied by others, which discouraged innovation. But the biggest problem was slavery. Because slaves were cheap and easy to get, wealthy families preferred to have everything made at home, exactly the way they liked it. For example, one rich man, Statilius Taurus, owned many highly trained slaves who made things like clothes, shoes, furniture, tools, and even built buildings. These were jobs that could have been done by businesses in the city. This system reduced demand for factory-made goods. It also discouraged the invention of new labor-saving machines, because slaves were already doing the work cheaply. If there had been more demand for better tools, industries might have grown faster. For instance, if someone had invented a valve for the bellows, it could have created a constant stream of air and made iron production much more efficient. But because slaves did this work and weren't encouraged to think or improve their tools, no one developed it. Another big reason industry stayed limited was that wealthy Romans looked down on industrial work. Like in other aristocratic societies, they preferred farming and land owning, which were seen as more noble. Industry was also closely associated with slaves, which made it seem dishonorable. In the end, it's fair to say that Roman industry had advanced as far as it could by the time of Emperor Augustus, and it would not go much further as long as slavery remained a central part of the system. From today's point of view, businessmen had a difficult time during the final years of the Roman Republic. The wealthy class, often used for government services or political alliances, was generally in conflict with the senatorial nobility, especially after the political unrest caused by the Gracchus brothers. Gaius Gracchus had strengthened the position of the equestrian class, bringing them together with the common people to challenge the Senate. But later, in 64 BC, the Senate made peace with them to defend their interests against Catiline's rebellion. For a short time, between 70 and 66 BC, the equestrians seemed powerful. They helped overturn Sulla's constitution in 70 and pushed for a strong foreign policy in 67 to 66. Still, their success wasn't due to their popularity or leadership skills. Roman history shows no example of a great leader from a business background. Sulla's political system was outdated from the beginning and collapsed easily. Pompey acted as the public face of the revolt that most Romans supported. Crassus managed the politics, Cicero provided the speeches, and the equestrian class paid the bills. In return, businessmen got rewards. They supported the campaign to stop pirates who threatened trade, and then helped send Pompey to defeat Mithridates and organize eastern provinces, opening up new areas for business expansion. So yes, wealthy Romans did gain some profits through politics. But they were always reminded that politics came first, and money had to serve political needs. In 82 BC, Sulla took property from 2,600 equestrians to refill the treasury. He also demanded $20 million from Asian cities for helping Mithridates. When these cities couldn't pay, they borrowed from Roman financiers. But Lucullus, working for the Senate, allowed the cities to skip the interest payments, so the businessmen lost their money. In 43 BC, the triumvirs needed to pay for a huge army. They blamed wealthy people for being disloyal and took their property. 2,000 equestrians were killed and their wealth seized. It's no wonder that Roman businessmen usually tried to avoid politics. Instead, they invested their money in distant lands or quiet banking. During the civil wars, people realized that money was power, but it shouldn't compete with political power. If someone with money was not loyal to the government, their wealth had no protection. This situation continued into the empire. Rich men gathered huge wealth from across the empire, but emperors, when they needed money, often seized their property using any excuse. For centuries, Roman money followed the army as it expanded inland. When cities became crowded or people started looking to trade by sea, new military colonies were created inland. This pulled people back to the land, just like in early American history, where expanding frontiers made people leave trade and return to farming. But when the Roman army expanded beyond Italy into Spain, Greece, Africa, southern Gaul, and Asia, fewer Romans were willing to settle there. The land in foreign areas didn't feel like home, and even Gracchus couldn't convince many people to support overseas colonies. Back in Italy, however, Roman wealth grew quickly. Historian Baylock estimated that after the Punic Wars and land seizures in the Po Valley, the total area under Roman control doubled, reaching about 14 million acres. At a modest price of $50 per jugerum, this land was worth about $1 billion. That means many of the 320,000 citizens in Gracchus's time were fairly wealthy, especially since large estates were already common. Even so, there wasn't always much ready cash. Most farmers didn't use banks, and agriculture moves money slowly. Any extra savings were stored at home, often in a strong box, until the owner found a nearby plot to buy. Later, this investment habit spread into the provinces. Romans preferred to invest their extra money in land, where it felt safest. Examples: Cicero owned city and farm properties. Atticus had large estates in Epirus and Italy. Varro invested in Campania and Apulia. Officers under Caesar, like Labienus and Mamurra, bought land after gaining riches from war. Most of Cicero's lawsuits were about land rights in Gaul, Etruria, and Lucania, and his letters mention large estates in Greece, Sicily, and Asia. In the last century of the Roman Republic, many wealthy Romans began putting their money into new areas, such as government contracts, money lending, banking, and trade. The importance of state contracts is often overstated, mainly because these contracts were talked about a lot in political speeches and letters. Just like today, the news might focus heavily on a government contract worth $1 million, even though much more money is invested in other businesses. In truth, state contracts probably made up less than 1% of the total capital invested in real estate in Rome at the time. Of the $10 million of state revenue estimated in Cicero's time, about 2/3 didn't go through the hands of the publicans. Only Asia was fully handed over to them. In other provinces like Sicily, Spain, Africa, and Gaul, they only collected smaller taxes. Sometimes public construction projects like roads, aqueducts, or harbors brought profits, but these were carefully supervised and cost-controlled. Most of the time, the work was done properly and honestly. In fact, if you look at the well-built roads, docks, and aqueducts still standing today, it's clear that these contracts were taken seriously. Some taxes were easy to check, like port fees, which were based on ship cargo lists, or pasture dues, which were based on the number of cattle. But with grain taxes, the system was easily abused. The amount owed was hard to calculate, and the local people couldn't afford to travel to Rome to file complaints. Even if they did, jurors might own shares in the companies they were complaining about. Provincial governors, even if they didn't like the contractors, often stayed quiet to protect their careers. As a result, many cities were cheated. Some tried to protect themselves by bribing tax collectors or governors. Others were forced to borrow money at high interest rates from the same collectors just to pay their taxes. This created a corrupt and abusive system, especially in Asia, until Julius Caesar finally reformed it. The situation in Asia was as bad as the one in pre-revolutionary France, where tax collection was so corrupt that the cost of collecting taxes was often equal to the amount collected. But not all the blame should go to the tax companies. The aristocrats in the Senate also played a large role in the suffering of Asian cities. For example, when Sulla forced them to pay $20 million in fines, the cities were left in deep debt for generations. The interest on those debts became an even heavier burden than the regular taxes. Also, the Senate didn't always act fairly toward the companies. There was an old agreement that if a company lost money due to war or disasters, the Senate would forgive part of the tax. But in Cicero's time, political arguments often blocked these repayments, leaving the companies to take all the losses. Because of this, many careful investors stayed away from public contracts, and the job was left to less honest businessmen. These companies then tried to recover their losses by cheating and overcharging. That's why Caesar eventually decided to manage Asia like the other provinces, limiting the power of these companies. During the empire, companies were only trusted with tasks that could be easily watched and controlled, so there was less risk of corruption. As a result, less money was invested in these companies, fewer people bought shares, and Roman writers talked about them much less in later times. In the last century of the Roman Republic, many wealthy Romans began investing their money in state contracts, money lending, banking, and trade. One key figure in this business world was the negotiator, or businessman. At first, this word referred to men who went abroad to lend money, buy land, or invest where they could earn high profits, sometimes also doing some trading. This shows that early Roman businessmen didn't have full control of trade systems, and that business roles weren't clearly separated yet. Later, during the empire, as business became more organized and banking in the provinces became less risky, the word negotiator came to mean simply trader. But here we're focusing on the Republic-era negotiator, who did many different types of business. A perfect example is Rabirius Posthumus, a client of Cicero, who can be compared to modern adventurous businessmen involved in risky investments, like foreign bonds, mines, and even political conflicts. Rabirius inherited a fortune from tax collecting, but also worked in public contracts, high-interest lending, shipping, and trade. In 57 BC, the king of Egypt, who had been overthrown, came to Rome asking for help. When Rabirius heard that Caesar and Pompey might support the king, he joined a group that loaned the king a large sum of money, with Egypt's tax revenues as security. Though the Senate refused to officially support the king, the Roman governor of Syria, influenced by Pompey's allies, helped the king return to power anyway. Rabirius went with the king to Egypt to make sure the money was repaid. He even ran state monopolies in Alexandria and surprised the Italian port of Puteoli when a fleet of his ships arrived loaded with valuable Egyptian goods. However, when the Senate saw that the king had returned to power without its permission, it punished the governor and exiled him. Rabirius ended up imprisoned by the king, but later escaped. His lawyer claimed he had gone bankrupt, but the Senate suspected this was a trick to fool the Senate and the Egyptians. Rabirius was likely exiled from Rome for a time, but Caesar gave him a government position during the Civil War, likely letting him make money again. This story is typical of how businessmen, negotiatores, operated in the late Republic, taking big risks for big rewards. In the late Roman Republic, the banking system developed more slowly than expected, considering how large and complex the Roman state had become. In the provinces, many financial needs were handled by the tax collection companies, which moved money and credit from place to place. In the eastern regions, local Greek and South Italian bankers were already well established, but civil wars, like those of Sulla, Marius, Catiline, and Caesar, taught wealthy Romans an important lesson. It was safer to keep financial records private, often managed by trusted freedmen, rather than in bank ledgers that government officials could access and use to seize property. Another reason for the slow growth of banking was the aristocracy's general dislike of business. Unlike some Greek states or the Ptolemies of Egypt, The Roman government never created state banks, nor did it encourage banking through official oversight. In fact, Augustus later privatized the banks in Egypt. Still, there were several successful bankers in Rome during Cicero's time, although many were foreigners or from Campania. Some important names include Appius Ignatius the Spaniard, Cluvius, and Vestorius of Puteoli. These bankers ran large offices and had the public's trust. They took deposits and paid interest, lent money, bought and sold real estate, both for themselves and for clients, exchanged foreign currencies brought to Rome through trade, hired business experts, especially those familiar with provincial investments, and travel. Cicero, for example, gave letters of recommendation to the agents of Appius and Cluvius so they could more easily do business with provincial governors. There was very little syndicate banking because industries hadn't grown large enough to require it. But when cities needed large loans, bankers sometimes acted as agents for wealthy nobles, formed temporary partnerships to manage deals. Some of these bankers even had branches or partners in the provinces, allowing them to send or receive money between cities. But the system of foreign exchange was not yet well organized. For example, when Cicero wanted to send money to his son in Athens, he gave his Rome rental income to Atticus. In return, Atticus told his banker in Athens to credit Cicero's son and to take that amount from Atticus's estate income in Epirus. This shows how indirect and informal international banking still was. We can learn more about the growth of Roman business overseas from inscriptions found on the island of Delos. In 169 BCE, after defeating Macedonia, Rome gave Delos to Athens, on the condition that it would remain a free port. Because of this, Delos became a major hub for Eastern trade. Ships came from the Black Sea, Syria, Egypt, and Italy. When Corinth was destroyed in the mid-2nd century BCE, Delos became the main port for Greek trade with the West. Around 20 years later, Asia became a Roman province, and Delos became a stopover for Roman tax collectors and merchants managing royal estates. Delos became a place to sell goods collected as taxes, and by the end of the 2nd century BCE, Italians controlled much of the local trade. However, most of these Romans were not from Rome itself. They mostly came from southern Italy, such as Campania and Magna Graecia. In Roman treaties, these areas had been granted the same rights as Roman citizens. The local Roman communities in foreign cities were made up of people from all over Italy, not just from Rome. Two major business groups in Delos were bankers, olive oil merchants. Both were made up mainly of southern Italians. The bankers included a Greek from Syracuse, a man from Tarentum, a Syrian who became a citizen in Naples, and Apulian Aufidius Bassus, whose exact origins are unclear. The olive oil merchants were also from southern Italy, and they sold South Italian oil in the eastern markets. Is it possible that Rome herself had not yet truly entered the world of trade or capitalism, even though her armies had opened up huge new areas? Could it be that only those people who were already active in sea trade really took advantage of the Pax Romana and the so-called freedom of the seas that came with the spread of Roman power? It's clear that southern Italian merchants and their banker partners were the first to benefit from Rome's expansion into the east. The Greek cities in southern Italy, from Tarentum to Cumae, had long been seafaring communities. They were skilled in trade and shipbuilding, and Rome often relied on them to provide ships and sailors for its navy. Because of this, their merchant fleet stayed strong, with well-maintained shipyards and trained crews. Also, these southern Italians, being Greek speakers familiar with both Eastern customs and Roman ways, were naturally suited to act as middlemen between Eastern and Western markets. Still, it's hard to believe that these Greeks of southern Italy could have taken over so much of the Delian trade just by using their own money. It's very likely that wealthy Romans from Campania helped by providing capital to support these shippers based in Puteoli. For example, Plutarch says that Cato the Elder invested in marine insurance partnerships, which might be explained by his connections in Campania, where many businesses were located around the port of Puteoli. Cicero, in his speeches and letters, tells us that many Romans who traded in Sicily and beyond, men like Vestorius, Granius, Cluvius, and Citius, operated from Puteoli as their home base. So, what do the Delian inscriptions about Roman business really tell us? When Rome took control of Macedonia and later Asia, the first wave of trade and banking between Rome and the East was carried out by southern Italian businessmen, often backed by Roman investors willing to take risks. Later, when tax contracts for Asia were sold at Rome, the companies that won these contracts needed many clerks and agents who spoke Greek and understood Eastern customs. At first, they probably hired staff from southern Italian firms already experienced in the region. Eventually, Roman business agents who went to Asia began reporting back on new opportunities for profit. This attracted more Roman investors, who slowly became directly involved in Eastern trade. When Mithridates raided Asia and attacked Delos, not many actual Romans were killed, but the financial loss hit Rome's investors hard. Even though investing in the East was sometimes risky, it could also be very profitable. Many Romans bought cheap land, which was being sold by locals who were afraid of wars and instability. But the Romans believed that Roman rule would bring peace, law, and order, so they bought up land confidently. As a result, many of Cicero's friends owned large estates in the East. Moneylending was often more profitable on the frontiers of the Roman world, where interest rates were much higher. In Rome, the court strongly protected private property, so much so that Sallust once complained that they cared more about property laws than human rights. As a result, interest rates in Rome stayed low and stable, usually between 4% and 6%. In Greece, where laws were not as protective of lenders and people were more willing to take risks, rates were usually 10% to 12%. In Asia, where political instability, foreign invasions, and unclear financial practices made things riskier, even 12% was considered low. And this was in peaceful times. After Mithridates' raids, investors would only lend money if they were offered very high returns. This was similar to early American history, when bankers in cities like Boston charged 5 to 6%, but demanded 24 to 48% interest when lending money out west, where risks were higher. Even some growing cities had to borrow at rates as high as 36%. In such conditions, Cicero's letters famously reveal how the Stoic philosopher Brutus secretly charged 48% interest in Cyprus. Although he was embarrassed and tried to hide it, he didn't return the extra money once he was caught. Even at 12%, which was the legal maximum, Roman bankers made great profits, especially once Roman law courts promised to protect lenders. Because of this, large amounts of money were lent by bankers and agents to struggling kings, cities in debt, individuals needing funds. For example, the king of Cappadocia owed Pompey and Brutus millions of dollars. The king of Egypt borrowed millions from Rabirius and his group. Cluvius of Puteoli lent large sums to 5 cities in Asia, using both his own and others' money, including Pompey's. Other indebted cities included Lampsacus, Tralles, Sardes, Mylassa, Alabanda, and Heraclea. Before Pompey's eastern campaigns, Asia's cities owed about $40 million, mostly to Roman lenders. If this earned even 12% interest, then private investors in Rome made twice as much from these loans as the government earned in annual taxes from the region. Bankers were not highly respected in Roman society. Respect for bankers only came much later, when they began helping with large industry projects or financing government debts, things that Rome generally avoided. Instead, most Romans dealt with bankers as money changers or lenders to young noblemen, often giving risky loans to young aristocrats waiting to inherit family wealth. Some nobles, like Caesar, Antony, Caelius, and Curio, took on huge debts, which gave banking a bad reputation in the public eye. Even in proper investments, wealthy Romans often didn't need bankers. They used personal stewards to take care of money. But because freedmen were once slaves, their involvement in business did not improve the reputation of the business world. Sometimes these stewards, or bankers, were asked to place money in eastern cities or lend to foreign rulers. Rich men like Pompey preferred not to do such deals in their own name. So they used bankers to act as go-betweens. While Pompey politely thanked these bankers in letters, he avoided being seen talking too much with them in public, like in the Forum. Cicero, who wanted to build a strong alliance between rich businessmen and the noble class, was a bit friendlier. He sometimes invited bankers like Vestorius to dinner. But even he looked down on them slightly in his private letters and speeches, using patronizing words like negotiatores, feneratores, and toculiones. Caesar, who valued efficiency, allowed capable businessmen like Balbus into the Senate, but this made traditional senators unhappy. When bankers like Vestorius were well respected, it was usually because of their good character, education, and because they avoided dishonest business, not because society admired the profession. St. Paul's trip as a prisoner from Jerusalem to Rome was full of events, which was not unusual for a voyage across half of the Mediterranean Sea. To find a ship going toward Rome, the Roman officer in charge of him first took him on a small local ship at Caesarea. They sailed along the coasts of Syria and Cilicia. At Myra, they changed to a larger Alexandrian ship heading west. However, the winds were against them. They wanted to stop at Crete for the winter, but a storm pushed them into the Adriatic Sea. In the storm, they threw some parts of the ship into the sea to stay afloat. Eventually, they reached the island of Malta. There, the ship's crew became afraid and planned to escape, leaving the 276 passengers behind. The Roman soldiers stopped them. The ship later hit rocks, and the wheat cargo was thrown overboard, but it didn't help. The ship broke apart, and the passengers had to swim or float to the shore on broken pieces of the ship. They spent the whole winter on Malta. In spring, they left on another Alexandrian ship that had also wintered there. The ship first stopped at Syracuse, then at Rhegium, and finally reached Puteoli. From there, the people going to Rome traveled the rest of the way, about 150 miles, on foot. Today, we might say Alexandria was about a 3-day journey from Rome. Cicero gave a short account of his 250-mile sea journey across the Aegean in a letter to his friend Atticus. He said the trip took 16 days and was peaceful, without fear or seasickness. It took him 6 days to go from Athens to Delos, even though it was only 100 miles. He wrote that although it was summer, the weather was not always calm. On July 6th, he reached Zoster in strong winds, and the wind kept him there on the 7th. The next day he had a good sail to Chios, then to Gyro in rough but not dangerous winds, and then to Syros and Delos faster than planned. He joked about how risky the small Rhodian boats were, and said he wouldn't leave Delos until the Gyrae peaks were clearly visible. Today, steamships can travel from that area to Smyrna in just 1 day. It's interesting that neither Paul nor Cicero traveled on Roman ships. Paul traveled on 2 Alexandrian and 1 Asiatic cargo ship. Cicero, because of his high position, used a private ship, which was likely from Rhodes. The fear of sailing back then wasn't because sailors didn't know how to sail. Greeks were excellent sailors, and not because the ships were too small. Large cargo ships at that time were around 200 to 300 tons, about the same size as early American trading ships that sailed to India and China. The real problem was that ancient sailors didn't have a compass. This forced them to stay close to coastlines or island routes, which made them more vulnerable during storms. Because of this, most ships stopped sailing in winter when the sun and stars weren't visible for navigation. We don't know much about how Roman sea trade worked during the late Republic. In Athens, however, we can learn a lot from legal speeches, which often mention ships and trade. But since Romans didn't do much trading themselves, Roman speeches don't tell us much. Some legal cases from Roman law books help fill the gap. Although these cases are from a slightly later period, they still show how sea trade developed from earlier Greek practices. Greek traders, like American merchants in colonial times, usually owned their own ships, and sometimes even built them. They sailed from port to port with whatever goods could bring the best profits. They used their own money, or borrowed at high interest. They bought and sold goods themselves, and near the end of the sailing season, looked for a cargo to take home, and waited there for spring. They also rented out space on their ships to other merchants who filled special orders. But this was a smaller part of their business. Ships with regular routes and schedules were rare. When a trader became rich, he would buy more ships and send trusted workers to do business for him. These workers had less freedom and followed strict orders, which slowly led to more planned trade routes and less free-form traveling. Still, this type of organized shipping did not grow much in Greece. During Cicero's time, shipping was still mostly irregular, especially in the eastern parts of the Mediterranean. There, Greek and Eastern sailors were still the main players at sea. A sailor's guidebook called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea shows that traditional merchant traders were in control of trade in the Arabian, Persian, and Indian waters. An order made by Emperor Claudius to help increase grain imports suggests that the same person could sometimes be a shipbuilder, shipowner, and grain trader all at once. For example, the fictional character Trimalchio is shown as a rich man who built his own ships. The writer Philostratus also assumed that Greek merchants traveled with their goods from one port to another. But when Romans started to build ships and join international trade, a more organized system began to appear. Roman law experts like Ulpian and Paulus show that shipowners would often hire ship captains to carry goods for merchants, a system very similar to how shipping works today. These ships often had fixed trade routes and dealt in specific types of cargo. Some ships, such as those sailing between Brundisium and Dyrrachium, even offered regular passenger services. This more organized trade system was a natural result of Rome's growing needs. When timber became harder to find in some places, shipbuilding moved to areas with better resources. As some merchants got richer and expanded their businesses across many regions, they needed to hire agents and supervisors to manage parts of their trade. This helped create large import-export companies that controlled trade from offices on land. Also, the Roman government began supporting regular trade routes, especially with grain-producing areas, to ensure a steady food supply for Rome. Scheduled shipments became common, and shipping companies could now rely on these routes and plan their business accordingly. Although Roman involvement in this industry grew, we don't have many detailed records. Cicero mentions a man named Lentulus, who owned ships sailing between Athens and Rome. Another man, Rabirius, may have owned a fleet, possibly tied to Egypt's royal trade. Later, during the Empire, when private companies couldn't provide enough grain ships for Rome, Emperor Claudius tried to solve the problem by encouraging Roman shipbuilders and traders to help. However, his efforts didn't fully work. That's why Emperor Nero later had to offer tax breaks to foreign traders to encourage their help. The fact that several foreign shipping companies had offices at Rome's main grain port in Ostia shows that Nero's plan worked better than Claudius's. To understand Rome's trade before the empire, it helps to look at Puteoli, the main Roman seaport of that time, located on the Bay of Naples. During the Second Punic War, Rome had trouble fighting Hannibal at Capua because it didn't have a nearby port. So after the war, Rome sent 300 men to settle in the old town of Puteoli. This small group was mainly meant to guard the port. The Senate didn't realize how important the place could become. No land was given to help the settlement grow or support more people. Port taxes were introduced, and to encourage trade, another customs post was placed between Naples and Campania. Puteoli started growing as a Roman port and became more important than Ostia, even though it was 150 miles farther from Rome. The reason was that Puteoli had a deep, safe harbor and also offered goods for ships to take back, while Ostia, close to Rome, had very little for return cargo. Puteoli's growth was helped by nearby industries. The iron industry from Populonia moved there and expanded into towns like Cals and Minturnai. Capua's high-quality bronze products were being sold widely across northern and western regions. Many of these items were shipped to Marseille and then moved up the Rhone River into Gaul and Germany. Another important local product was pozzolana, a volcanic sand from Puteoli that was excellent for making strong cement, especially useful for building harbors and deep structures. Puteoli also exported sulfur from the Solfatara area and pottery made from Ischia's clay. Because of all this, the port kept growing in importance, though slowly, since it had to compete with nearby Naples. In the time of the Gracchi brothers, the poet Lucilius called Puteoli a lesser Delos. At that time, Delos had about 10,000 to 15,000 people. Puteoli also benefited from being close to older Greek ports like Naples. It could attract skilled sailors, shipbuilders, and workers from well-equipped Greek shipyards. After Rome gained control of eastern provinces, many Greek-speaking workers and business managers came to help Roman trading companies and investors. Some bankers, like Philostratos from Syria, moved to Naples to take advantage of the growing business ties between the Greeks and Romans. These bankers made money especially by offering marine insurance to both Roman and foreign merchants loading goods at Puteoli. The social war in 90 BC helped Puteoli in a surprising way. Cicero's Verrine orations give us some clues. When towns like Pompeii, Nola, and Abella supported the allies and later joined Marius's political side, they were punished. Many people from those towns fled to Spain and joined Sertorius, a rebel leader. When his power faded, some of these refugees, used to sea life, became sailors. Some even worked with pirates in Spain and Cilicia. Eventually, many of them started working for shipping companies in Puteoli. When the Roman official Verus tried to arrest suspected pirates at Sicilian ports, businesses in Puteoli protested. They claimed he was wrongly arresting their sailors, staff, and even company members. This event tells us a lot about Puteoli's trade connections, even though Cicero tried to hide the less respectable parts of the story. Puteoli soon began to look partly Eastern, because merchants from big eastern ports, like Tyre, Beirut, and Nabatea, set up offices there, just like later foreign trading houses in Venice during the Middle Ages. These foreign traders rented docks and storage buildings, took over certain parts of the town, built their own temples, and even had their own cemeteries. For example, in the 2nd century, the Tyrian trading station was still paying 100,000 denarii a year in taxes and rent, even though it had shrunk in size. Traders from Beirut and the Nabateans had their own temples, and people from Baalbek had a 4-acre cemetery. There are also many inscriptions left by people from eastern cities, showing how active they were. All this raises a serious question. Did the Romans ever truly become skilled sailors and traders on the sea? We don't need to follow the full story of trade through the entire empire. It's enough to say that when Emperor Claudius built a proper harbor at Ostia and cleared the mouth of the Tiber River, Puteoli lost a lot of its shipping business, especially the grain trade. Still, since Ostia didn't offer many goods for return shipments, it couldn't take over all sea trade. Many ships preferred to dock at Puteoli and send goods to Rome by land or small boats along the coast. Italy's trade was unbalanced. Even during Campania's best times, Puteoli couldn't fully load the ships that arrived full of goods. Italian wines went east through Egypt, according to the Periplus, but these were likely cheap Calenian and Falernian wines used as ship ballast. Fancier wines from Latium couldn't compete with the better Greek wines. Latium also began exporting some olive oil in Cicero's time, but this didn't last. Later, during the empire, when Rome realized the value of olive oil, most of it was imported from Spain and Africa. Latium also didn't produce important manufactured goods. In fact, Rome isn't even listed among the exporting cities in the Periplus. Campania exported iron, bronze goods, pottery, wine, olive oil, and perfumes from Capua. The Po Valley in northern Italy sent wine, pitch, wood, grain, pork, wool, and cloth mostly to Rome. We even find jars from Venice and Istria in the far mountain valleys of the Tyrol. Aretine pottery, which was once popular across the western provinces, lost its market when potteries in Gaul took over the business. That's the main list of Italy's important exports. Clearly, Italy couldn't keep a balanced trade. The only reason the books balanced was because of Rome's huge profits from investments and the constant flow of taxes and tribute from the provinces. Even with that, the government worried about too much gold and silver leaving the country. This led to strict rules, like the law from Gabinius in 67 BC that banned people from the provinces from borrowing money in Rome. Cicero, during his time as consul, even tried to have customs officers at Puteoli confiscate all gold and silver being exported. But these efforts didn't work in the long run. Pliny the Elder, writing a century later, said that at least $5 million worth of gold and silver was leaving the Roman world every year to buy luxury goods from China, India, and Arabia. Most of Rome's imported goods, other than grain, came from the east. The provinces of Asia and Pontus sent items like grain, dried fish, wood, dried fruits, gemstones, wine, and luxury items such as rugs and tapestries, for which Anatolia is still known today. From Syria came glass products made in Sidon, and purple cloth and dye from Tyre, which was famous for them. Fine linens came from Byblus and Beirut, and cedar wood from Lebanon was also highly valued in Rome. In peaceful times, northern Syria also connected with the trade routes from Parthia, where merchants brought goods from China and India, like silk, cotton, pearls, ivory, and spices. In the south, Nabatean traders brought incense, spices, myrrh, and gemstones to Gaza. Egypt's state-run factories exported high-quality cloth, glass, and papyrus. Merchants from Alexandria also shipped ivory from Ethiopia, wild animals for Roman games, and African slaves. They also moved goods from India and Arabia through the Red Sea. This eastern sea trade grew quickly under Emperor Augustus, who adopted the trade policies of the former Egyptian rulers, the Ptolemies. His support led to huge increases in shipping at the Red Sea port of Myos Hormos. The western regions sent fewer luxury items and more raw materials. Marseille, still a Greek city at the time, controlled trade along the Rhone River. It brought metals, animal hides, raw wool, salted meat, cheese, slaves, and amber from the north. In exchange, Marseille received Roman iron, bronze, pottery, and fine Eastern goods. Merchants there also brought tin from Britain via the Rhône and Seine rivers. Further west, the Roman colony of Narbo built new roads through the Gironde region to reach British tin and the mines of Aquitania. Northern Spain exported large amounts of metal and also goods made from its excellent steel. Central Spain produced high-quality wool and linen fabrics. Southern Spain became an important source of olive oil, wine, wheat, salt pork, fish, and leather, mostly shipped by traders from the port of Gades. Even though trade was large, transportation and sales were not very organized or consistent. There weren't standard systems of selling or distributing goods, but generally, each port had a wholesale market where sellers and buyers could meet. In earlier times, when trade was less structured, merchants simply brought whatever they had, unloaded it at the market, and tried to sell it while their ship was docked. At the same market, they could buy goods from others to take to the next port. Local shopkeepers also came to these markets to buy products to sell in their own stores. In this older system, there weren't many professional salespeople or middlemen. However, in more advanced trade systems, like the one at Puteoli, some middlemen were still avoided. For example, Tyrian traders didn't sail with their goods. Instead, they rented warehouses and dock space at Puteoli, where their partners or agents received the shipments. These agents displayed and sold the goods to local retailers. They also had offices in Rome, where part of the goods were sent. Inscriptions in Puteoli show that many eastern cities used this system. Even in Delos, a Greek island, Roman traders used a similar method, and the stations in Ostia were built by Rome, likely for the same purpose. As trade became more advanced, some commission-based trading offices probably started to appear, although we don't have detailed records of them. There wasn't much of a developed sales system like we have today, probably because there were very few factories that sent out traveling salespeople. Instead, products usually came to the buyers through the market system, which worked well enough at the time. But there is some evidence that buyers placed direct orders with producers. At pottery workshops in Auvergne, in France, large records of orders have been found. These seem to be wholesale orders placed ahead of time. If this example was common, it suggests that buyers sometimes visited the factories directly to place their orders. In ancient times, producers were generally much closer to consumers than they are today. In international trade, merchants would bring goods directly to harbor markets, where retailers or local buyers could purchase them. Within towns, many producers were also craftsmen and shopkeepers who made and sold their own products from small workshops. There were very few middlemen involved. Shipping costs, both for goods and people, were quite reasonable, even though sea travel was slow and insurance costs were high. This was possible because ships were built and operated by cheap labor, and harbor fees were lower than modern customs tariffs. For example, 1,000 bricks, over 2 tons, could be shipped 100 miles from Athens to Delos for only 15 to 20 drachmas, about $3 to $4, which was about a quarter of their price. A shipment of red pigment, minium, from Athens to Chios cost only 1 obol. A ton of stone from Paros to Delos cost 25 drachmas because heavy cargo was difficult to load and unload. In the 3rd century AD, shipping wheat from Alexandria to Rome cost just 2 cents per bushel, about the same as modern prices. These ships were probably insured for free by the state. For most tramp shipping, where merchants sailed around selling their own cargo, set shipping rates were not important because the merchants traded directly at each stop. Passenger fares were also low, though the travel experience was rough. Passengers had to bring their own food, sleeping conditions were poor, and there were no refunds or compensation in case of shipwrecks. For example, a trip from Aegina to Athens cost 2 obols. From Alexandria to Athens, the fare was just 2 drachmas. Crossing the Aegean Sea cost 4 obols. Some Romans did get involved in trade, despite the Senate's reluctance. If we look at both written sources and inscriptions, it's clear that many Romans entered the business world across the provinces. For example, Cicero's speeches Pro Quinctio and Pro Fonteo show that the Roman colony at Narbo was successful in taking trade from Marseille. The colony in Carthage, however, failed to become a trade center because the Senate refused to allow a real city to be built. As a result, nearby African cities like Utica took over the trade instead. Roman merchants also showed up in other regions, like Cirta in North Africa during the Jugurthine War. Cicero's Verrine speeches reveal that in Sicily, Roman merchants, including moneylenders, land speculators, and some Campanian traders, were active even though the Senate blocked Roman tax collectors from operating there. Romans also entered the province of Asia to take advantage of deals offered by local tax collectors. While the Senate didn't give Romans special tax benefits, Roman citizens still had some advantages. As citizens of a powerful nation, they often received favorable treatment in legal matters. In foreign cities, Roman citizens and other Italians formed communities called conventus. Governors were required to choose jurors from these groups when Romans were involved in legal cases. This meant Romans usually got fair, or even slightly biased, treatment, unless the governor was openly hostile to businessmen, like Verus. These conventus of Roman bankers, tax collectors, merchants, landowners, and retired soldiers existed in almost every major city by the end of the Republic. Records mention them in 25 cities of Asia, 12 cities of Greece, 7 in Africa, 5 in Sicily, 3 in Syria. However, we need to understand what negotiator meant during the Republic. It mostly referred to bankers and land speculators, not merchants. Also, many of the so-called Roman traders were actually Italians or Greeks from southern Italy, who had only recently gained Roman citizenship through the laws of 89 and 88 BC. Many Roman citizens living in the provinces were ex-soldiers who earned citizenship through military service. Most trade linked to public tax farming was temporary and depended on state contracts. There are very few examples of Roman merchants who ran their own shipping businesses, Lentulus being one of the rare names mentioned. So while it's tempting to assume Romans were heavily involved in commerce, this view may be exaggerated. The presence of Roman trading communities and businessmen doesn't necessarily mean there was widespread Roman control of trade. In the eastern provinces, mentions of Roman businessmen and trading communities quickly disappear during the early empire. This shows that their involvement in trade was weak. Many Roman bankers and investors had come earlier to make money during chaotic times, but they didn't do well once peace was established and local people regained control of their finances. Eastern trade stayed mostly in the hands of native merchants, and the grain trade that Romans had joined later died out as Egypt and Africa became more important suppliers. Over time, Westerners who had settled in the East, like Italic Greeks, freedmen, army veterans, and colonists from Caesar's time, lost their Roman identity and blended into Greek culture. In places like Corinth, Antioch, and Sinop, settlers became so Greek that they even stopped writing correct Latin on their tombstones. Roman investments still remained in the East, especially large farms that were bought or taken over through unpaid debts. But it's likely these lands were managed by local people, with only occasional visits from Roman supervisors. So overall, the East remained under local, non-Roman social and economic control. In Egypt, which Augustus turned into a Roman province, Roman businessmen were even less successful. The Ptolemaic rulers before Augustus had already created a strong system of state-run trade, especially in Alexandria, and the Roman emperors saw no need to change that. Because everything was tightly controlled and there were few good opportunities, most Roman merchants stayed away. In contrast, the western provinces were more open to Roman business. The people there had simpler cultures and were eager to learn Latin, buy Roman goods, and follow Roman ways. When the city of Marseille fell during the Civil War, Roman colonies like Narbo, Lyons, and Arles became new cultural and trading centers. From these places, Romans spread out to lend money, buy land, and organize trade using riverboats on the Rhone, trade routes over Toulouse to Bordeaux, and supply bases along the Rhine for merchants trading with Germany. Many of these traders had Greek names, as did many freed slaves, who were very active in trade. Native Gauls also joined the trade system, as shown by their Celtic names, but Roman influence was strong enough, thanks to naturalization laws and Roman schools, that by the 4th century, more people in Gaul probably read Latin authors like Virgil and Cicero than in Italy itself. Inscriptions from Rome support what we see in Cicero's writings. Romans didn't generally like being involved in trade. While rich merchants were respected, successful wholesale dealers were often former shopkeepers, and this background was looked down on in Rome. That's one reason so many foreign cities had trading posts in Rome, Ostia, and Puteoli. It's also why most Roman wholesalers had Greek names. Freedmen were the ones who took over this work. After gaining freedom through loyal service to their masters, they used the skills and money they had earned to take on the kinds of business that traditional Roman nobles avoided. A good example of this type is Trimalchio, the freedman in Petronius's Satyricon. In one scene, he brags to his guests about how he made his fortune in the port city of Puteoli. He says, "I used to be just like you, but I used my brains and now look at me. I buy cheap and sell high. That's my secret. I started with nothing. I was so small I used to measure myself against a lamp. But thanks to good luck, I became the boss in my master's house. When he died, he left me a fortune, shared with the emperor. But I wanted more. So I built 5 ships, loaded them with wine and sent them to Rome. All 5 ships sank. I lost 30 million sesterces in one day. Did I give up? Never. I built better ships, loaded them with wine, pork, beans, perfume, and slaves. Even my wife helped. She sold all her jewelry and gave me 100 gold coins. That little bit of money brought me great success. On one trip, I made 10 million sesterces. Then I bought back all the estates that belonged to my old master. I built a house, traded cattle, and made even more money. When I became richer than everyone in town, I stopped working and let my freedmen run the businesses for me. I built this house from what used to be a shack. Now it's a palace, with upstairs dining rooms, guest rooms, a nice bedroom, a porter's room, everything. Let me tell you something. If you have only 1 coin, that's all people think you're worth. But if you're rich, people treat you like a king. I went from being poor to being a prince. People have often believed that work is a punishment, something forced on humans after being cast out of paradise. This idea likely comes from the natural tendency of people to avoid effort. Ancient thinkers like Aristotle and Zeno didn't fully agree with this religious explanation, but they still looked down on manual labor. They believed that hard physical work left people with little time or energy for thinking or moral growth. Still, ancient workers didn't usually fall into despair. They had other instincts and simple comforts that helped them carry on. Many ordinary people may have found comfort in the idea that the meek and humble were somehow blessed, though such thoughts rarely made it into writing. Philosophers like Cicero and Posidonius, who followed elite traditions, shared a common dislike for physical labor. Their opinions were shaped by a society where slavery was widespread and manual labor was left to the lower classes. The poet Virgil, however, often questioned the values of his time. He believed in the value of hard work. In one of his poems, he humorously described how Jupiter ended an age of lazy happiness by taking away nature's gifts, like honey falling from trees or rivers of wine, so that humans would be forced to invent tools and learn skills. Virgil admired the simple farmer, even one who had once been a pirate, saying he was as proud as a king. He always remembered the hard-working people of his hometown, Mantua, and often wrote while living near Naples, where he watched craftsmen and shipbuilders at work. He was also influenced by the philosopher Lucretius, who saw the history of tools and crafts not as greedy or shameful, but as signs of human progress. So while some Romans, like Cicero and his circle, disrespected labor, that was not true for everyone in Rome. In Cicero's time, most of the labor in cities and on farms, especially around Rome, was done by slaves and former slaves. All the people working in Cicero's household were in this group: servants, secretaries, managers, messengers, tutors, even researchers who helped him with his books. His friend Atticus, who published books, owned many skilled slaves who copied manuscripts and checked them for errors. When Cicero needed something built or repaired on his land, he often gave the job to his slave farm manager. Slaves and freedmen were also often in charge of renting land or managing gardens. Rich Roman homes were filled with slaves doing every kind of job: taking care of jewelry, keeping shoes, dancing at dinners, guarding clothing, and more. A large number of slaves showed off one's wealth, and some houses had hundreds or even thousands of slaves just for that purpose. Big farms were usually managed by a villicus, a head slave, who oversaw teams of slave workers. Roman writers like Varro and Columella believed this group was enough to handle all kinds of farm work, even building, repairing, and blacksmithing. Legal writers like Alphinus and Trebatius also mentioned that individual farms often had their own weavers, smiths, barbers, bakers, and other skilled workers. Still, small independent farms never completely disappeared in Italy. They survived especially in areas like the Po Valley, in mountain regions where only small plots could be used, and along the southern coast where Greek settlers kept their old farming traditions. There was also a growing trend, especially during the Empire, of renting farmland to freedmen or trustworthy slaves. In many cases, these slaves eventually earned their freedom by proving they could manage land responsibly. In Cicero's time, most factory work was done by slaves. For example, at the pottery workshops in Arretium and in brick factories, freedmen were often the managers. This suggests that slaves did the hard physical labor. In factories in the Campania region, it's harder to be sure because many workers had Greek names, and in that region, Greek names didn't necessarily mean someone was a slave. But in Pompeii, there seems to have been a large number of free Roman workers. That makes sense, especially in places where Greek workers were common and labor traditions were stronger. At Ostia, the port city of Rome, we have helpful records from a workers' guild. These records show that there were very few native free Roman workers there in the 2nd century AD. One list includes 320 ship carpenters, all skilled workers. Slaves are not listed, probably because slaves weren't allowed to join the guild. But this doesn't mean there were no slaves working in the shipyards. Only 4 names on the list belong to free immigrants, and such people were rare in Rome. Very few names in the guild list sound like traditional Latin names. Many have Greek names, which may suggest they came from Naples or southern Italy. But it's more likely these names show that the people were descendants of slaves. The most common names on the list are those of the imperial household. names given to slaves or freedmen who once belonged to the emperor's estate. Other names like Verna, Restitutus, Mansuetus, Successus, Hilarus, Fortunatus, Vitalio, and Publicius also show up often. These names were commonly used by freedmen or people whose parents or grandparents were slaves. So we can say that about 75% of the shipbuilders at Ostia were freedmen or their children. A similar result appears in the membership list of the Transport Workers Guild, which had nearly 400 members. Many of them were former public slaves of Ostia, recognized by names like Publicius or Ostiensis. This shows that freedmen played a major role in this kind of labor too. In small shops, where making and selling goods were often done in the same place, we can identify three main types of shopkeepers. The first type is the independent craftsman. He is usually a free citizen who rents the shop, uses his own money, and works at the bench himself. He might have one or two slaves helping him. For example, many plumbers in Rome fit this model. The second type is a freedman or trusted slave who, as a reward for loyal service, is given some money, either as a loan or as a partnership. He combines this with his personal savings to run the business. Roman legal experts discussed many such cases in the digest, especially under the law de tributoria actione. This model was very common, and many Pompeii shops, especially those attached to homes, likely operated this way. The third type involves wealthier people who owned shops but did not work in them directly. Instead, they hired slaves or freedmen as shop managers, paying them a share of the profits to motivate them. This system was also widespread. It is discussed in Roman law under De Institutoria Actione, where we find phrases like, if your slave is acting as a shop manager or working at a money exchange table. A study of inscriptions that clearly identify people as workers shows that slaves and freedmen made up the majority of laborers in the Roman Empire. Out of 1,854 worker names studied, 67 were slaves, 344 were freedmen, 459 were free but had Greek names, and 919 had unclear names. Only 65 were clearly freeborn Roman citizens. So, it seems that only about 15 to 20% of workers were freeborn, while 80 to 85% were either slaves or freedmen. However, this isn't a perfect picture. Slaves are less likely to be mentioned in inscriptions, and many freedmen didn't gain freedom until old age, some only when their masters died and freed them as a final gesture. If we had a real-time list of workers, instead of tombstone inscriptions, the number of slaves would probably be even higher than that of freedmen. This situation is surprising, and it raises the question, what happened to the poor freeborn Romans? One possible explanation is that Julius Caesar and the later triumvirs had recruited many poor Romans into the army during the civil wars, offering them land in return. Many of these veterans were later settled on farms in Italy, in places like Cremona, Luceria, and Beneventum, so they stayed part of Italian society but didn't become industrial workers. Others were sent to colonies in Spain and Gaul, such as Cordova, Tarraco, and Lyons, where they helped spread Roman civilization and became valuable citizens. But the many settlers sent to colonies in the Greek East, like Philippi, Corinth, Beirut, and Sinope, seem to have quickly adopted Greek ways and moved away from Roman culture. Most of them also shifted from city jobs to farming, so they no longer participated in Roman industry or trade. We should also consider that inscriptions might not tell the full truth. Eastern immigrants in Rome may have valued skilled work more than native Italians and were more willing to mention their jobs on tombstones. In contrast, native Romans might have preferred to avoid working with slaves and chosen instead to live off the free grain they received from the state. This could help explain the high number of freedmen in the worker records. Yet even freedmen quickly absorbed Roman attitudes. The character Trimalchio in Satyricon, for example, brags about retiring from business after getting rich and says he handed over his money to freedmen, bought land, and built a grand house. It's also likely that many of Rome's poorest freeborn people disappeared into remote rural areas or mountain regions. This is similar to how many poor white people in the southern United States became isolated when slavery pushed them out of the job market. In some cases, those groups turned to theft and banditry. So even though many details are still unclear, one thing seems certain. Most of the work in Rome was done by slaves or people who had once been slaves. The conditions of slave workers were very different depending on where they worked. On large farms managed by another slave, the treatment of workers depended on the manager's personality. Since the landowners rarely visited, cruel or greedy managers often mistreated the laborers. This was also true in mines, where the lowest class of slaves usually ended up, and probably in factories too, where managers pushed workers hard to earn the owner's approval and profits. In places like factories, there were no rules about how many hours a person worked, and it was common to use whips and chains for discipline. Still, we shouldn't compare this to modern forms of slavery, especially those made worse by racial and cultural differences. In Rome, although Romans were proud of their identity, they didn't see slaves as naturally inferior. Many Roman slaves were smart and educated. They served as managers, writers, artists, doctors, architects, and teachers. Roman literature even shows that clever slaves often helped their masters solve problems. Cicero, for example, wrote kind and caring letters to his slave Tiro, which could be mistaken for letters to a close relative. Wealthy Romans trusted their slaves to handle important business across the provinces. Many freedmen were given the chance to run shops and businesses as partners. Opportunities like these were rare in modern slavery systems and in class-based European societies where slavery didn't exist, but social mobility was limited. From a financial point of view, freeborn workers were often worse off than slaves and freedmen. They had fewer chances to get help or support from rich patrons. They were usually excluded from trusted jobs, which were given to well-trained and long-serving slaves. Even easy or non-demanding jobs usually went to slaves who were familiar with routines. Free workers had no master to loan them money to start a business, and they didn't fit easily into work teams of slaves, either on farms or in homes, where strict discipline was expected. In places like factories, mines, or docks, they might find work, but only if they asked for no more pay than what it cost to maintain a slave. A typical slave laborer cost about $200 to buy and around $20 per year to maintain, which included 2 tunics, 1 pair of shoes, some wheat, leftover food, and a place to sleep in the slave quarters. A free worker might ask for a little more than this, but not much. We don't have many records of actual wages. In Delos during the 3rd century BC, temple records show that unskilled workers, both free and hired-out slaves, were paid about 20 to 30 cents per day. Surprisingly, even highly skilled jobs like architects weren't paid much more. In Caesar's colony at Urso in Spain, town clerks earned about 20 cents a day. The poet Horace probably earned something similar when he worked as a clerk in Rome. For Egypt during Augustus' reign, we have more wage data, but it's not useful for comparison because Egypt's economy was fully controlled by the government. Wages there were very low, between 3 and 8 cents per day. Cicero once described a weak slave as being worth less than 12 cents per day, which was clearly below the standard wage. Under Julius Caesar, Roman soldiers earned 225 denarii per year, which came out to about 15 cents per day without food. But soldiers also expected extra rewards, like war loot or land after their service. Later, when the empire was in decline, Emperor Diocletian tried to stop rising prices by limiting how much workers could be paid. His law set maximum wages for many jobs. These wages were in addition to basic food and shelter. Here are some examples from Diocletian's wage list. Unskilled worker, 10.8 cents. Bricklayer, carpenter, stonemason, blacksmith, 21.6 cents. Shipbuilder, 21 to 26 cents. Painter, 32.4 cents. These wages included food and a place to sleep. In modern times, food and housing are about 1/3 of a worker's total expenses. But in ancient Rome, especially if the worker had a family, these basic needs made up about 80% of daily costs. So Diocletian's wages might actually seem generous compared to earlier times. For the late Republic period, it's likely that wages were similar to those in Delos, around 1 denarius per day. That's about the same as what Italian farm workers earned during harvest season in the 1870s, just before Italy united under King Victor Emmanuel. It's clear that ancient free laborers didn't raise large families or send their kids to college. But could they survive at all? Not as well as urban slaves, surprisingly. Slaves were usually fed and clothed well enough to stay healthy and productive. Their wives and children also received basic care. Children born into slave households were often trained in skilled jobs, which could bring them closer to their master and give them better opportunities. On the other hand, free laborers had to find and pay for their own housing, and if they had kids, they had to feed them too. Their wives usually worked as well. So how could such poor families survive on low wages? If we compare this situation not to today, but to the lives of English workers before cheap grain laws, Italian workers before 1870, or poor Japanese before World War I, we see that survival, though difficult, was possible. When we try to calculate the cost of living, we must remember that living meant very different things in a society with slavery. For example, Cicero believed his son, while studying in Athens, needed $4,000 a year to keep up with rich young men like Messala and Bibulus. Cicero himself felt he had to live in style, with a fancy house in Rome, a country villa, and at least one seaside vacation home. Sometimes 3. But Cicero wasn't extremely rich. He just wanted to live like a former consul. Meanwhile, workers didn't need to worry about social image. They just needed to survive. The Roman state helped with that. Sunlight kept them warm, so they needed little clothing. They had access to free public baths, and they enjoyed free public entertainment during holidays. Their diet included no meat. Roman soldiers had conquered the world on wheat porridge. In Cicero's time, any Roman citizen in the city could buy a soldier's wheat ration, about 1 bushel a month, at 1/3 of the regular price. Later, during the empire, this ration was given for free. In cities without free grain, a bushel cost about 75 cents, or just 2.5 cents per day per person. People added a little cheese, vegetables, olive oil, and watered-down wine. Diocletian's price list, higher than earlier times, shows cheese at 7 cents per pound. You could buy 3 cabbages or 6 turnips for 1 cent. These vegetables could be grown year-round in sunny areas near Rome. A pint of cheap wine cost 1 cent, and it was mixed with water to last longer. Olive oil cost a bit more, but was used sparingly. That was the basic food budget. It wouldn't make sense to compare this with modern detailed cost of living lists. About 8 cents a day, or 6 cents with free grain, covered groceries. As for clothing, 1 pair of shoes, often skipped altogether, cost no more than 50 cents. 5 pounds of wool, at about 10 cents per pound, were enough for 2 tunics. A worker's wife usually spun and wove the fabric by lamplight. And the mild Italian climate helped protect bare skin from harsh weather. Rents in Republican Rome were generally low. For example, the politician Callias was seen as spending extravagantly when people believed he paid $1,500 a year for a house in a wealthy neighborhood. But Cicero argued it was only $500, and that the higher number was just a rumor spread by the owner to increase the home's value. If someone like Callias paid $500 to live in an upscale area like the Palatine Hill, then the rent for a basement or attic in a poorer area like the Subura must have been much lower. Although we don't have rent prices for Rome, records from the island of Delos, during its peak, show that shops and modest homes for workers were rented at about $1 or $2 a month. Since building materials and labor were cheap in Rome, rents there were likely similar. Even in more recent times, farm workers near Rome built their own simple huts out of straw and wood for almost no cost. Ancient workers probably did the same, or they rented small rooms in cheap apartment buildings or slept in their shops. Rent was a very small expense for those who didn't care about social status. Bathing and socializing after work were important parts of daily life for Roman laborers. Cities or wealthy citizens built many public bathhouses where entrance was free or cost no more than 1 cent. These bathhouses acted like clubs where workers could relax and talk with friends after work. Thanks to government aid and Italy's mild climate, a laborer didn't have to fear starving or freezing. If he stayed healthy and could find work, he could afford to marry. His wife might earn money by spinning yarn, weaving cloth, or helping in shops. Children started working at a young age. There wasn't any money left for entertainment, but the government knew the risks of a bored population. So, on many public holidays, they provided free events like chariot races, theater shows, wild animal fights, gladiator games, parades, and even mock sea battles. The emperors had found a simple way to keep the masses calm. Give them free food and free entertainment, panem et circenses. But there was one major worry that wasn't covered. How would poor families pay for a proper burial, which cost about $10? To deal with this, workers formed burial clubs. These groups collected small monthly payments to cover funeral expenses. They also arranged a respectful procession at the member's death. During the Empire, there were no major slave rebellions or worker revolts in Italy. Workers seemed mostly content. Whether they were also good citizens under these conditions is another matter. Most workers were part of collegia, or trade guilds, but these were not like modern labor unions. They couldn't bargain for better pay or conditions because of constant competition from slave labor. There are no records of labor strikes in Italy. If a worker refused a job, he could easily be replaced by a slave. It's possible that the earliest guilds, which some say began in Rome's monarchy period, were formed to meet real economic needs. Back then, industry may have been healthier, trade more active, and slavery less widespread. The political protests of early Republican Rome, like the secessions to the Sacred Mount, might have been inspired by labor actions or involved workers' groups, but historical sources don't say for sure. Later, in the Empire, the government organized the guilds to help with public needs like grain transport and fire services. In exchange, the state gave guilds certain benefits. These guilds sometimes used their political connections to gain even more privileges. For example, the bargemen on the Tiber River managed to secure special rights through a powerful supporter, and the laundry workers of Rome took legal action to get their water access restored. However, examples of guilds gaining influence later in the empire show new trends and don't reflect the original purpose of these groups during the Republic. In earlier times, most guilds existed mainly for social reasons, broadly speaking. In a city where shops were small and carried only limited goods, customers had to move from one shop to another to compare prices. As a result, people who made the same kinds of products often set up their shops near each other. This naturally created close-knit groups, since they shared the same profession and worked in the same area. Because of this shared experience, it was easy for them to form burial societies, join in religious practices together, and gather for meals or conversations about their trade. These guilds often carved their membership lists into stone, along with official-sounding titles for their officers. This gave them a sense of pride and dignity, even though society at large didn't hold them in high regard. The real reason these groups stayed strong was because they provided a very practical service, collecting small membership fees and organizing shared burial spaces for urns. By sharing funeral costs, they eased people's fear of dying without a proper burial and gave the poor some peace of mind about the afterlife. Their social meetings weren't just for fun either. They also included religious rituals, pouring out wine to honor the spirits of dead members or former patrons. Because of this, members often called each other commestors and convictor. The rules of one such group give us a window into how these societies worked. It is agreed that anyone who wants to join the group must pay a joining fee of 100 sesterces, about $3 at the time, and bring a large jug of wine. He must also pay a monthly fee of 5 asses. If a member in good standing dies, the group will pay 300 sesterces for the funeral. 1/6 of that amount will be given to the people who attend the funeral. The funeral will take place on foot. If a member dies by suicide, the society will not pay for his burial. If a slave member gains freedom, he must give the group a jug of good wine. If a properly elected officer fails to host a dinner for the members, he will be fined $1. Each officer must supply 1 jug of good wine, 2 cents worth of bread per person, 4 sardines, and take care of the meal. If a member causes trouble by switching seats, he will be fined 12 cents. If he insults another member, the fine is 36 cents. If he insults the leader, he must pay 60 cents. Julius Caesar probably didn't design his political program with detailed economic plans in mind. Still, more than any other Roman leader, he showed an understanding of how economic issues were connected to politics. While it's risky to say he had a fixed policy, we can assume that his admiration for the reformers known as the Gracchi helped him recognize the importance of trade and industry. At the same time, his ties to the aristocracy gave him respect for property rights. His conflict with Pompey, however, wasn't just about economic ideas. The Senate claimed that if Caesar won, he would ignore property rights and take land from the rich to give to the poor. Pompey said landowners would join him out of fear of Caesar, but that didn't happen. Many senators supported Pompey, not because they feared losing land, but because they saw that Caesar's rise would destroy the Senate's power. Wealthy citizens outside the Senate didn't distrust Caesar, and they were proven right. After he won, he refused to give in to radical demands for debt cancellation, forced land reforms, or mass confiscations. Caesar ruled as dictator for only 5 years, and most of that time was spent in military campaigns. Yet in the short time he had to govern, his economic planning showed that he had a clear vision of what the empire needed. He also had a remarkable ability to design long-term reforms. If Caesar had lived longer, he likely would have ended the old Roman policy of hands-off economics, where the state avoided interfering in trade. He clearly planned to use government power to support business and trade across the empire. One of his actions was to rebuild Corinth, where he sent a colony of freedmen, former slaves used to city life and familiar with Greek language and commerce. The goal was not just to settle people, but to turn Corinth into a trade hub. Caesar even planned to dig a canal across the narrow land, isthmus near Corinth, to create a shortcut between Asia and Italy. Though the canal project was abandoned after his death, Corinth quickly grew and became the richest city in Greece a generation later. Caesar used the same strategy in other parts of the empire. Pompey had already set up administrative centers in Pontus and Bithynia, but Caesar understood that these areas also needed better trade connections to the Mediterranean. So he sent freedmen to the Black Sea ports of Sinope and Heraclea. These colonies were not meant to spread Latin culture, because the settlers spoke Greek and soon forgot the little Latin they had learned. Instead, the colonies helped local economies and also reduced the number of foreigners living in Rome who didn't fit into Roman society. Caesar used this logic when he founded a colony in Carthage as well. The Senate had refused to rebuild Carthage, afraid it might grow into a strong Punic city again. Instead, Utica, a small allied city, became the center of government and trade in the province, even though this was not ideal. Caesar corrected this by ordering the rebuilding of Carthage. The new city became one of the empire's most important ports. In Spain, Caesar founded the colony of Hispalis in a key location near the sea, which allowed easy shipping access. He also created Arelate to be a trade port in Gaul, competing with the long-dominant Greek city of Marseille, which had controlled most trade in the region until then. Caesar didn't forget about Rome's own port either. The port at Ostia had many problems. The Tiber River's mouth filled with silt quickly, and the fast current made the harbor unsafe. As a result, more ships went to Puteoli than to Ostia. To solve this, Caesar planned a new barge canal. It would run from Rome along the Tiber River to Ostia, then continue south along the coast all the way to Puteoli. This was an ambitious plan. It aimed to improve trade across the entire empire, from the Black Sea to beyond the Straits of Gibraltar. Considering that Caesar had only a few months to design it, and that parts of the plan were actually carried out, it's reasonable to believe he would have expanded government support for trade, and possibly for industries as well, if he had lived longer. If such a policy had continued under future emperors, with the same vision and intelligence that Caesar had shown, Rome's economic and political future might have taken a very different path. Caesar also showed a strong interest in improving agriculture. He was the one who originally planned a tunnel to drain Lake Fucine, a project that Emperor Claudius later tried to complete. The goal was to turn the lakebed into fertile farmland in central Italy. Caesar also ordered engineers to plan the draining of the Pontine marshes, both to recover land and to make the area healthier. These two major projects had to wait until modern times to be finished, because the emperors who followed Caesar did not have his ambition or foresight. But Caesar's thinking went beyond just getting more farmland. He understood that saving Italy's population of free citizens was essential to keeping the heart of the empire strong. To help with this, he passed a law that required at least 1/3 of the workers on Italian farms to be free-born citizens. This was the first serious attempt in Rome to slow down the growth of slavery. When seen alongside his decision to send many freedmen to colonies outside Italy, it shows he was ready to rebuild Italy's society. The Gracchi brothers had long ago argued that having many small farms run by citizens was better than a few large plantations using slave labor. But even after Roman citizenship was given to all of Italy in 89 BC, the government in Rome still prevented these new citizens from voting effectively. Caesar began to change this. In a local government law he left unfinished at his death, there is a part that included the population lists from local towns into the main national list at Rome. This may have been a step toward holding national elections by using local voting. Whatever the exact goal, the part of the law we have shows that Caesar was no longer following the traditional Roman belief that only the city of Rome should dominate Italian politics. Caesar also brought a new approach to the provinces and their people. In Gaul and Spain, he gave Roman citizenship generously. According to the writer Suetonius, 80 people from the provinces were even allowed into the Roman Senate, which upset many old Roman nobles. Caesar's actions in Gaul, even before becoming dictator, were unexpected for his time. He directed most of his military efforts along the Rhine and focused on fighting the German tribes in the north. By doing this, he avoided causing destruction in Gaul itself. Most of the slaves and spoils came from the north. He only took land from a few people who rebelled against Rome. He didn't create new colonies in Gaul and allowed local tribes to keep their self-government, while granting Roman citizenship to many locals.